There is a place in the American Southwest where the stone itself seems to remember, where canyon walls rise so high that the sky becomes a thin ribbon of blue far above your head. And the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat echoing back at you off the rock. These canyons have held their secrets for 700 years, longer than most nations have existed, longer than most languages have survived, long enough that the people who built their homes into the very face of the cliffs have passed from history into something closer to legend, leaving behind only the rooms they carved, the pottery they painted, the corn they ground, and a silence so deep it feels almost deliberate, almost like a choice. You have probably heard the word before, Anasazi. It moves through popular imagination the way certain words do, carrying weight beyond its letters, suggesting mystery and ancientness and things that cannot be fully explained. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado, the great kivas buried beneath the desert floor at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the towers that rise above the Utah red rock like fingers, reaching for something no one alive today can name. These are the works of a people who were here, fully and completely here, for more than 1,000 years, and who then, in the space of a single human generation, were gone. That is the question that has haunted archaeologists, historians, and curious minds for over a century. What really happened? Where did they go? Why did they leave behind everything they had spent generations building? Rooms that took lifetimes to carve, roads that stretched for hundreds of miles across the desert, great houses that aligned themselves with the movements of the sun and moon, with a precision that still astonishes researchers today. Why would any people walk away from all of that? The easy answers have always been the least satisfying. Drought, climate change, resource depletion. These are the explanations that appear in textbooks, and they are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete. They are the kind of answers that explain the mechanism without touching the meaning. They tell you what the trigger was, without telling you what was already loaded into the chamber long before anyone pulled it. The full story of the Ancestral Puebloans, which is the name their descendants prefer, and which we will use alongside the older term throughout this telling, is a story that goes back much further than most people realize. It is a story of adaptation and ingenuity, and spiritual architecture and social collapse and migration and survival. It is a story that is still being written, because the people did not disappear. They transformed. They moved. They became someone else while remaining, in some essential way, exactly who they had always been. Tonight, we are going to follow that story from its beginning. We are going to walk through 10,000 years of human presence in the canyon country. We are going to sit inside the great houses and understand why they were built the way they were. We are going to feel the pressure building across the centuries, the droughts and the conflicts, and the spiritual reckonings that eventually pushed an entire civilization to make one of the most dramatic decisions in the history of the ancient world. And we are going to follow them south, into the Rio Grande Valley and the high desert of Arizona, to find where they went and what they became. Before we begin, I want to take a moment, as I always do, to acknowledge the people who are listening to this in the dark. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? The canyon country of the American Southwest is not a gentle landscape. It does not invite you. It does not make things easy. The Colorado Plateau, that vast elevated tableland that covers the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet at a single point on the map, is a place of extremes so stark they feel almost theatrical. In summer, the exposed rock surfaces can reach temperatures hot enough to blister bare skin. In winter, blizzards sweep down from the north with a savagery that leaves the landscape buried and still under feet of snow. Rain falls in violent, concentrated bursts that carve new channels through the sandstone within minutes and then vanishes for months at a time. The wind is constant, patient, and absolutely without mercy. The soil, where it exists at all, is thin and fragile and dependent on a very precise balance of moisture and temperature that can be disrupted by a single bad season. And yet people chose to live here, not just to pass through, not just to shelter briefly against the cold, but to build their entire civilization in this demanding, difficult, beautiful country. That choice made over and over again across thousands of years, tells you something important about the people who made it. It tells you that they were not here because this was the easiest option. They were here because they understood this landscape in ways that took generations to learn, because they had developed technologies and social structures and spiritual frameworks specifically adapted to its demands, and because, in some way that is difficult to articulate, but easy to feel when you stand in these canyons, this place was home in the deepest possible sense of that word. The story begins long before the cliff dwellings, long before the great houses, long before pottery or agriculture, or any of the things we associate with settled civilization. It begins at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the first human beings moved into the canyon country following the great megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons, and giant ground sloths and camels and horses that roamed the American West in those cooler, wetter millennia. These were the Paleo-Indians, and the traces they left behind are sparse and scattered, mostly in the form of distinctive stone spear points, found embedded near the bones of extinct animals at kill sites scattered across the plateau. They were hunters, mobile and adaptable, moving with the seasons and the herds, carrying everything they needed on their backs. The land they moved through was different from the land we know today. The Colorado Plateau in that era was cooler and significantly wetter, covered in grasslands and open woodlands that supported the enormous herds of Ice Age megafauna. The canyons that would eventually become the heartland of ancestral Puebloan culture were carved by rivers running higher and faster than they do today. The desert was not yet the desert. It was something more forgiving, more various, more alive, with the particular kind of abundance that draws and sustains large populations of both animals and the people who followed them. Then, over the course of several thousand years, the climate shifted. The great ice sheets retreated northward, the continent warmed, the grasslands dried. The megafauna, under simultaneous pressure from climate change and human hunting, disappeared, one species at a time, until the last mammoth had fallen and the last horse had vanished from North America, not to return until the Spanish brought them back on ships 17,000 years later. The people who had built their entire way of life around hunting these animals had to make a choice: adapt or follow the megafauna into oblivion. They adapted. This is the first great story of human resilience in the canyon country, and it set a pattern that would repeat itself many times across the millennia to come. When the large game disappeared, the people turned to smaller animals, to rabbits and deer and bighorn sheep, to birds and lizards and insects, to anything that moved and could be caught. More importantly, they turned to plants. They learned to read the desert landscape with extraordinary precision, understanding which seeds were edible and which were poisonous, which roots could be roasted to become nutritious, which cacti contained water and medicine, which grasses produced grain in sufficient quantity to be worth harvesting. They became the most skilled foragers in North America, which is saying something because the competition was formidable. This period, which archaeologists call the Archaic, stretched from roughly 8,000 years ago to somewhere around 2,000 years ago, a span of time so enormous that it is difficult to hold in the mind without losing its scale. 6,000 years. The entire span of recorded history, from the first Sumerian cities to the present day, fits comfortably within this single phase of southwestern prehistory. For all of those thousands of years, the people of the canyon country lived as mobile foragers, following the seasonal rounds of plant and animal resources across a landscape they understood with an intimacy that no modern human being could replicate. They left behind grinding stones, smoothed by generations of hands, processing seeds and nuts. They left behind stunning rock art, painted and carved into the canyon walls in styles that shifted and evolved over the millennia, suggesting not a single static culture, but a dynamic tradition in constant conversation with itself. They left behind fiber sandals woven so tightly and skillfully that examples preserved in dry caves still hold their shape after 5,000 years. And then, approximately 2,000 years ago, something new entered the canyon country from the south. Agriculture, specifically corn. Maize had been domesticated in central Mexico thousands of years earlier and had been slowly spreading northward through trade networks and migration for centuries. When it arrived in the southwest, it arrived with squash and eventually with beans, completing the agricultural triad that would become the foundation of ancestral Puebloan civilization. These three crops, grown together in a system that modern farmers have only recently come to fully appreciate, complemented each other almost perfectly. The corn provided carbohydrates. The beans provided protein and nitrogen that replenished the soil that the corn depleted. The squash spread its broad leaves across the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining soil moisture. Together, they could sustain human populations at densities that foraging alone could never support. But agriculture in the Canyon country was not a simple transplant of techniques developed in the wetter, richer soils of Mexico. The Colorado Plateau presented challenges that required ingenious solutions. Rainfall was unpredictable and often insufficient. The growing season was short. Frost could come early in the fall and late in the spring. The soil varied enormously from one location to another, rich and productive in canyon bottoms, but thin and fragile on the mesa tops. The people who adopted agriculture in this landscape had to become engineers as well as farmers, developing systems for capturing and directing the precious rainwater that fell in concentrated bursts, for storing surplus food against the inevitable years of scarcity, for identifying the microclimates within the canyon systems where crops could be grown most reliably. This is when we see the first traces of the culture that would eventually build the cliff dwellings. The people of this early period, roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, are known to archaeologists as the basket maker period, a name that celebrates one of their most remarkable craft traditions. The baskets they made were not simple utilitarian containers, they were works of art and engineering, woven in complex geometric patterns, using techniques that required years to master, sealed with pine pitch to make them waterproof, sized and shaped for specific purposes, from the carrying baskets worn on the back, with a tump line across the forehead, to the flat winnowing trays used to separate grain from chaff in the desert wind. These people wove baskets the way later peoples would build cathedrals, with a combination of functional necessity and genuine aesthetic ambition that reflects a culture that took beauty seriously, even in the objects of everyday life. They were not yet building the stone architecture for which the ancestral Puebloans would eventually become famous. Their earliest shelters were simple, built partly below ground, circular or oval in shape, framed with wooden poles and covered with brush and earth. Archaeologists call these pit houses, and they were actually an excellent adaptation to the canyon country climate, the underground portion providing insulation against both the summer heat and the winter cold. The central hearth venting smoke through a hole in the roof, while warming the entire space with remarkable efficiency. These were not primitive hovels. They were sophisticated thermal designs that kept their inhabitants comfortable in conditions that would be challenging for most modern people without mechanical heating and cooling. The basket maker people lived in small, scattered communities, rarely more than a few families grouped together, connected to other groups by networks of trade and kinship that stretched across the plateau. They were already the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about this landscape, and they were adding to that inheritance with every generation, developing new agricultural techniques, refining their craft traditions, building the social and spiritual frameworks that would eventually support much larger and more complex communities. Somewhere around 700 CE, a profound transformation began. The basket maker period gave way to what archaeologists call the Pueblo period, and the change was visible most immediately in the architecture. The pit houses began to change. The underground chambers became deeper and more elaborately constructed, their interiors decorated, their entrances formalized, their relationship to the above-ground spaces more carefully considered. Above ground, rooms began to appear, at first simple and freestanding, then arranged in connected rows, then growing into the multi-room, multi-story structures that would eventually become the Great Pueblos. The circular underground chambers, the kivas, became the ceremonial and social heart of the community, the place where the men of the village gathered to conduct the ritual business that kept the world in proper order, where the winter kachina ceremonies were performed, where the histories and spiritual teachings were transmitted from one generation to the next. This shift from pit houses to above-ground masonry architecture was not just a change in building technique, it was a change in relationship to the land itself. A pit house can be abandoned relatively easily. Its materials are mostly organic, biodegradable, destined to return to the earth. A stone masonry structure is a statement of permanence, a commitment to a particular place that is difficult to walk away from. When the ancestral Puebloans began building in stone, they were making a declaration about their intention to stay, to put down roots so deep that they would outlast individual human lifetimes and become the inheritance of children not yet born. The stone they worked with was the sandstone of the canyon country itself, laid down in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods when this entire region lay beneath shallow inland seas, compressed over millions of years into the red and orange and buff-colored formations that give the Southwest its particular visual character. This sandstone has a quality that made it almost ideally suited to construction. It fractures along natural plains, producing flat-sided blocks that stack easily, that can be shaped with stone tools into the precise dimensions needed for a particular course of masonry. The ancestral Puebloans learned to read the rock the way a woodworker reads grain, understanding where it would split cleanly and where it would crumble, developing a sensibility for the material that allowed them to produce masonry of extraordinary precision without metal tools or mortar, made from anything more sophisticated than a mixture of clay and water and sand. The early Pueblo period communities were still relatively small and dispersed, scattered across the mesa tops and canyon rims in groupings of perhaps 20 to 50 rooms arranged in rough crescents or L shapes. Each community had its kiva, dug into the earth in front of the room blocks, its midden where trash and food waste accumulated over generations to create archaeological deposits full of information about daily life, its agricultural fields terraced into the canyon slopes or spreading across the mesa tops where the soil was deep enough to support them. The centuries between 700 and 900 CE were a period of gradual growth and increasing social complexity. Population was rising across the Colorado Plateau, supported by the agricultural surplus that allowed people to live at densities that foraging could never have sustained. Communities were growing larger. The room blocks were extending, adding stories, incorporating more kivas, developing the distinctive visual profile that would eventually culminate in the great cliff dwellings. Trade networks were expanding, connecting communities across hundreds of miles through the exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas, technologies, and spiritual traditions. And then, in the 9th and 10th centuries, something happened at a place in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico that would change the trajectory of ancestral Puebloan civilization more profoundly than anything that had come before it. Something happened at Chaco Canyon, the transition from the archaic period to the basket maker period, the shift from mobile foraging to the first tentative steps toward settled agricultural life was not a sudden event. It unfolded over centuries as the knowledge of corn cultivation spread slowly northward from its Mexican origins through trade and migration and cultural diffusion, arriving in the canyon country in forms that had already been adapted to the specific conditions of the intermediate landscapes through which it had passed. The first corn grown on the Colorado Plateau was a frost-sensitive, water-demanding crop that required significant modification before it could be cultivated reliably in the harsh conditions of the high desert. The process of developing the cold-tolerant, drought-resistant varieties that made ancestral Puebloan agriculture possible in the canyon country took not years, but centuries, each generation of farmers selecting the plants that had performed best in the previous year and saving their seeds for the next planting, accumulating across generations a body of agricultural knowledge that was encoded not in any written record, but in the genetic character of the plants themselves. This deep agricultural knowledge was one of the most important things the ancestral Puebloans carried with them when they left the canyon country in the 13th century. The corn varieties they brought to their new homes in the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi Mesas were not just crops, they were libraries, containing within their genetic structure thousands of years of accumulated observation and selection by farmers who understood their plants with an intimacy that modern plant breeders, working with sophisticated genetic tools, have only recently begun to appreciate. The traditional corn varieties maintained by Hopi farmers today, the blue corn and the red corn and the white corn and the sweet corn and the flower corn that have been grown on the Hopi mesas for centuries, are direct biological descendants of the corn varieties that grew in the fields of Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, carrying within them the selection decisions of farmers who have been dead for 700 years, but whose agricultural wisdom persists in the crops they tended. The cosmological understanding that structured ancestral Puebloan spiritual life was as carefully elaborated and as practically grounded as their agricultural knowledge. The world, as the ancestral Puebloans understood it, was layered, a series of worlds stacked vertically, the present world being only the most recent in a sequence of previous worlds from which the ancestors had emerged through the act of emergence itself, climbing through the sipapu, the opening in the earth, from the world below into the world above. The present world, the fourth world in most accounts, was understood as the current stage of an ongoing cosmic story whose earlier chapters had been played out in the previous worlds, and whose future chapters were still to be written in the actions of the living and the prayers and ceremonies, through which the living maintained their relationship with the forces that governed the order of things. This understanding of the world as layered and of the present as one stage in a longer cosmic narrative gave the ancestral Puebloans a relationship to time that was fundamentally different from the linear historical consciousness that modern Western culture has largely inherited from its Judeo-Christian roots. For the ancestral Puebloans, time was not a line moving from past to future, but a spiral, a pattern of repetition, with variation in which the present was always, in some sense, a recapitulation of the past, the same essential story being told again with different specific details. The migrations of the 13th century were not unprecedented catastrophes in this understanding. They were the latest expression of a pattern of movement and settlement and movement, again that the tradition described as inherent to the human condition, part of the design that the holy people had laid out at the beginning of time. The Kachinas, the spiritual beings who were the intermediaries between the human world and the forces that governed rain and fertility and the cosmic order, were understood as the returned spirits of the ancestors, coming back each year in the form of the masked dancers who impersonated them at the public ceremonies to bring their power and their blessing into the human world. The Kachina dances were therefore not just ritual performances, they were reunions, moments when the living and the dead came together in the plaza to renew the relationship between the human community and the spiritual community that sustained it. The ancestors were not gone. They were present in every ceremony, present in the seeds that the living planted in the fields that the ancestors had tended, present in the pottery that was made using techniques the ancestors had developed, present in the stories that transmitted their knowledge and their values to each new generation. This understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead helps to explain the care with which the ancestral Puebloans treated their burial places and the remains of their ancestors. The burials found in and around ancestral Puebloan sites are almost invariably accompanied by offerings, pottery, and tools and personal ornaments placed with the body as provision for the journey, or as expressions of the community's love and respect for the person who had died. The placement of burials beneath room floors in some periods and in middens in others reflects changing understandings of the appropriate relationship between the living and the dead. But in all periods, the care taken with burials reflects an understanding of death not as an end, but as a transition, a movement from one form of existence to another that maintained, rather than severed, the connection between the individual and the community. The spiritual life of the cliff-dwelling communities was also deeply connected to the landscape itself. The canyon country was not just the physical setting in which the ceremonies were performed, it was itself a participant in those ceremonies. Its specific features, its springs and its prominent rock formations, and its unusual geological structures, understood as locations where the membrane between the human world and the spiritual world was thinner than elsewhere, where communication between the living and the forces that governed the cosmos was more possible. The placement of shrines at specific locations in the landscape, the marking of ceremonially significant features with rock art The incorporation of specific landscape elements into the layout of the great houses and the roads all reflect an understanding of the spiritual significance of specific places in the canyon country that was as sophisticated as the astronomical knowledge encoded in the architecture. The mountains that surrounded the canyon country, the La Salle Mountains to the north, the San Francisco Peaks to the southwest, the Jemez Mountains to the east, the Chusca Mountains to the west, were understood as the homes of specific spiritual beings whose power and presence structured the cosmic geography of the ancestral Puebloan world. The four sacred mountains that define the Navajo homeland, a later elaboration of a cosmological understanding shared with the Pueblo peoples, reflect the same basic structure, a sacred landscape whose boundaries are defined by prominent geographical features understood as spiritual entities, and whose interior is therefore consecrated by their presence. The canyon country was not wilderness in the modern sense of empty nature, unenhanced by human significance. It was a sacred landscape, every feature of which was embedded in a web of meaning that connected the physical world to the spiritual world, and the present community to the ancestors who had inhabited this landscape before them. The loss of this landscape, when the ancestral Puebloans left the canyon country in the 13th century, was therefore not just the loss of familiar terrain, it was the loss of a sacred geography, the displacement from the specific web of place meanings that had structured the spiritual life of the community for generations. This is another dimension of the late 13th century crisis that is difficult to quantify but important to recognize. The places themselves were spiritual resources, and leaving them behind meant finding new sacred geographies in the new landscapes, identifying the features of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi Mesas that could serve the same spiritual functions that the canyons and mesas and springs of the northern San Juan region had served for the ancestors. The oral traditions of the descendant communities suggest that this process of sacred landscape identification was one of the primary activities of the migration period, with the clans and community groups of the migrating population exploring the new landscapes and identifying within them the features, the mountains, the springs, the unusual geological formations that could anchor a new sacred geography adequate to the spiritual needs of the community. The process was apparently successful, in the sense that the descendant communities established in the Rio Grande Valley and on the Hopi Mesas developed rich and enduring sacred geographies in their new homelands that have sustained their spiritual life across the centuries. Since the migration, the Hopi sacred landscape, centered on the Hopi Mesas themselves but extending outward to the four directional mountains and to the numerous shrines and pilgrimage sites scattered across the broader landscape, is a fully elaborated system of spiritual geography that is in no way impoverished by its displacement from the canyon country. It is a new creation, built in a new landscape by people who brought with them the capacity to sanctify place that their ancestors had developed over millennia of intimate relationship with the canyon country. And the canyon country itself, now largely within the borders of national parks and monuments managed by the federal government, has not lost its spiritual significance for the descendant communities. Hopi and Zuni and Rio Grande Pueblo people continue to travel to the ancestral sites, to conduct ceremonies at the shrines maintained there, to gather plants and minerals that have ceremonial significance, to maintain the connections to the places where their ancestors lived that are an essential part of their understanding of who they are and where they come from. The relationship between the Pueblo peoples and the landscape of the canyon country is not a historical curiosity. It is a living reality that shapes the cultural and spiritual life of these communities in the present, and it is a relationship that the National Park Service and the federal government have, with varying degrees of success and commitment, been working to recognize and accommodate in the management of the ancestral sites. This recognition, still incomplete and still contested in various ways, represents a significant shift in the relationship between the United States government and the descendant communities of the ancestral Puebloans. The history of that relationship is not a comfortable one. The sites that are now protected as national parks and monuments were, in many cases, extensively looted before federal protection was established. Their rooms emptied of the objects that were the most obvious evidence of the richness of the culture. Those objects dispersed to private collections and distant museums, where they remain largely inaccessible to the communities whose ancestors made them. The excavations conducted in the early decades of southwestern archaeology, while producing invaluable scientific information, were often conducted with a disregard for the spiritual significance of the sites and the human remains they contained, that the descendant communities found deeply offensive and that the more recent history of the discipline has been working to address. Chaco Canyon is not an easy place to reach, even today. It sits in the middle of the San Juan Basin, a broad, shallow depression in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where the land is flat and featureless in all directions for miles, broken only by low mesa escarpments and the occasional dry wash cutting through the pale soil. The canyon itself is subtle by southwestern standards, not the dramatic vertical walls of Canyonlands or the Grand Canyon, but a modest gash in the plateau cut by the Chaco Wash, a river that runs only after significant rains and spends most of its existence as a dry, sandy bed threading between low sandstone cliffs. The surrounding landscape is spare, almost to the point of severity. The vegetation is low and scrubby, dominated by sage and saltbush and occasional juniper trees twisted by the constant wind. The sky is enormous. The silence is the kind that makes you feel very small. And yet, in this unlikely place, between approximately 850 and 1150 CE, the Ancestral Puebloans built something that has no real parallel anywhere in the pre-Columbian world north of Mexico. They built Pueblo Bonito, which means beautiful village in Spanish, and which is almost certainly an understatement. At its height, Pueblo Bonito contained more than 600 rooms, arranged in a great D-shaped arc that rose 4 and possibly 5 stories at its rear wall, its curved face opening to the south to capture maximum sunlight in the winter months, while its thick walls and interior courtyard moderated the brutal summer heat. It was, for approximately 300 years, the largest building in North America, a single structure containing more rooms than any other building on the continent, until the construction of apartment houses in New York City in the late 19th century. But Pueblo Bonito was not alone. Along the 5-mile stretch of Chaco Canyon and its immediate tributaries, the builders constructed at least 11 great houses, each one a massive, carefully planned architectural achievement that dwarfs the contemporaneous structures found anywhere else in the ancestral Puebloan world. Chetroquetl, Pueblo del Arroyo, Una Vida, Jungo Pavi, Peñasco Blanco, each one oriented with deliberate precision relative to the movements of the sun and moon and certain prominent astronomical events, each one connected to the others and to a network of outlier communities scattered across a vast region of the Colorado Plateau by an extraordinary system of engineered roads. The Chacoan roads are one of the most puzzling and compelling aspects of the entire ancestral Puebloan phenomenon. Archaeologists began seriously studying them in the 1970s, initially using aerial photography that revealed the roads as subtle linear features in the desert soil, slightly different in color and texture from the surrounding ground, visible from the air in ways that made them nearly impossible to detect on foot. What the photographs showed was astonishing. A network of roads radiating outward from Chaco Canyon in multiple directions, extending for hundreds of miles across the plateau, connecting the canyon to outlier great houses as far away as the San Juan River to the north and the Chusca Mountains to the west. These were not informal trails worn into the earth by generations of foot traffic. They were engineered features, carefully laid out with a straightness that suggests the use of surveying techniques, their edges defined by low stone curbs or wooden posts, their surfaces cleared of vegetation and debris to create a smooth travel surface. In many places where the roads cross natural obstacles, they do not deviate around them. Instead, they cut directly through, climbing cliff faces by means of hand and toe holds cut into the rock, or descending precipitous slopes by means of stone stairways carved with considerable labor from the living bedrock. What makes these roads truly mysterious is not their construction, impressive as that is, but but their dimensions and what they were used for. The Chacoan roads are consistently between 8 and 10 meters wide, which is dramatically wider than would be necessary for foot travel, the only form of locomotion available to the ancestral Puebloans, who had no wheeled vehicles and no large domesticated animals capable of carrying loads. Why build a road wide enough for several wagons abreast when the only things that would ever use it were human feet? Some researchers have suggested that the roads served primarily ritual or symbolic purposes, that their straightness and their width were statements about the power and reach of the Chacoan system rather than practical transportation features. Others argue that they facilitated the movement of large numbers of people during ceremonial gatherings, that they were essentially pilgrimage roads along which the people of the outlier communities traveled to participate in the great ritual events at Chaco Canyon. Because ritual gatherings, it appears, were one of the central functions of Chaco Canyon, the great kivas, buried beneath the plazas of the great houses, are unlike anything found elsewhere in the ancestral Puebloan world. They are enormous, some measuring 20 meters in diameter and sunk several meters into the earth. Their walls lined with masonry of extraordinary refinement, their floors bearing the marks of massive wooden posts that once supported roofs spanning distances that challenged the structural limits of wood. The largest of these kivas could have held hundreds of people simultaneously, far more than would ever be needed for the ritual activities of a single community. They were built for crowds. The material evidence supports the idea that Chaco Canyon was a place where people gathered from across a vast region. The trash middens adjacent to the great houses contain pottery styles from multiple distinct regions of the ancestral Puebloan world, suggesting that visitors were bringing their own vessels with them from their home communities. The remains of macaws, those brilliantly colored tropical birds native to the forests of Mexico and Central America, have been found in considerable numbers at Chaco, indicating trade connections that stretched 1,000 miles to the south. Turquoise, which the ancestral Puebloans valued above almost every other material and worked into jewelry and ritual objects of extraordinary beauty, was present at Chaco in quantities that stagger the imagination, tens of thousands of pieces recovered from excavations, suggesting that the canyon was not just a consumer of turquoise, but a production center that processed raw material from the great turquoise mines at Cerrillos, near modern Santa Fe, and distributed the finished objects across the entire ancestral Puebloan world through its network of roads and outlier communities. The picture that emerges from all this evidence is of a regional system unlike anything that had existed before in the American Southwest, a network of communities across an area of perhaps 90,000 square kilometers, all oriented toward, and in some sense subordinate to, the great houses of Chaco Canyon. Whether this constitutes a true political system, with Chaco as a capital exercising actual authority over the outliers, or whether it was a more diffuse religious and economic network with Chaco as a pilgrimage center and ritual hub rather than a political capital, is a question that archaeologists have debated for decades without reaching consensus. The truth is probably somewhere between these poles, and it probably varied across the 3 centuries of Chacoan fluorescence, with the degree of Chacoan influence waxing and waning as conditions changed. What is clear is that the Chacoan system required enormous inputs of labor and material to build and maintain. The great houses consumed millions of stones, each one quarried from the canyon walls and transported to the building sites, shaped with stone tools to fit precisely into the masonry courses that archaeologists describe as among the finest examples of pre-Columbian stonework in North America. The timber used in the construction came primarily from the Chusca Mountains, 60 to 100 kilometers to the west, where ponderosa pine grew in forests thick enough to provide the massive roof beams that the great houses required. An estimated 200,000 trees were cut and transported to Chaco Canyon over the course of the construction period, hauled across the desert on human shoulders because the ancestral Puebloans had no wheeled vehicles and no pack animals beyond the dog. 200,000 trees, carried by hand across 60 miles of desert. The scale of that labor is almost impossible to comprehend. It implies not just an organized workforce, but a society capable of mobilizing that workforce, of convincing or compelling large numbers of people to participate in a project whose benefits were distributed across an entire region, rather than accruing immediately to the individuals doing the work. Whether this mobilization was voluntary, driven by the spiritual prestige of contributing to the great houses and the ritual life they supported, or coercive, driven by social hierarchies with the power to extract labor from lower status community members, is another question that the archaeological record cannot fully answer. The masonry of the great houses itself speaks to the presence of organized, skilled labor. Archaeologists studying the construction sequences of Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses have identified several distinct masonry styles, each representing a different period of construction and a different aesthetic sensibility about how stone should be laid. The earliest core and veneer masonry, in which a rubble-filled core was faced with carefully shaped sandstone blocks, gave way over time to increasingly refined techniques in which the facing stones were worked to extraordinary precision, sometimes with the addition of small spools, thin flakes of stone, inserted between the larger blocks to create a textured surface of great visual complexity. This is not the masonry of people slapping stones together as quickly as possible. This is the masonry of people who cared deeply about how the work looked, who brought an aesthetic sensibility to the act of construction that elevated it beyond mere engineering into something closer to art. Inside the great houses, the rooms were small and often dark, their walls plastered and sometimes painted, their floors beaten smooth by generations of use. The ceiling beams, still visible in the surviving structures, were finished with care, their bark removed, and their surfaces sometimes incised with geometric patterns. The doorways were T-shaped, a form that appears throughout ancestral Puebloan architecture and which may have had specific ritual significance, perhaps marking the transition between different spatial domains, between public and private, between secular and sacred. The windows were small, carefully oriented to capture light at specific times of day or year, some aligned with solar phenomena that marked important points in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. The astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon deserve particular attention because they speak to something essential about the civilization that built these structures. The ancestral Puebloans were not casual observers of the sky. They were systematic, sophisticated astronomers who tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets and stars with a precision that informed every aspect of their social, agricultural and spiritual life. The summer and winter solstices, the equinoxes, the movements of Venus, the 18-year lunar standstill cycle, all of these were incorporated into the orientation of buildings, the placement of windows and doorways, the design of the roads. The most famous of these astronomical features is the so-called sun dagger, discovered in 1977 on Fajada Butte at the southern entrance to Chaco Canyon. 3 large stone slabs, each weighing several tons, lean against the cliff face in a position that allows narrow shafts of light to fall through the gaps between them onto 2 spiral petroglyphs carved into the rock behind. On the summer solstice, a single dagger of light bisects the center of the larger spiral precisely. On the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light frame the spiral exactly on either side. On the equinoxes, a single dagger bisects the smaller spiral, while a second passes through the edge of the larger. The precision of this solar calendar is extraordinary, and the labor required to place the slabs in exactly the right positions to create these effects, trial and error over what must have been years or decades of observation, speaks to a level of astronomical sophistication and institutional commitment to skywatching that rivals anything found in the ancient world. But why? Why was it so important to know with such precision when the solstice arrived, when the equinox occurred? The answer lies in the absolute centrality of agriculture to ancestral Puebloan life. In a landscape where the growing season was short and the timing of planting could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation, knowing exactly where you were in the solar year was not an intellectual luxury, but a practical necessity. The astronomical observations that were encoded into the architecture of the great houses were not decorative, they were functional, a calendar system built into the very stones of the buildings, providing a precise and reliable framework for organizing the agricultural and ceremonial year. The Chacoan system reached its peak between approximately 1050 and 1130 CE. These were the decades when the great houses were at their most elaborate, when the pilgrimage roads were being extended and maintained, when the turquoise workshops were operating at full capacity, when the great kivas were hosting the ceremonies that drew people from across the region. The population of the canyon itself during this period was probably not enormous, perhaps a few thousand permanent residents, but the number of people who participated in the Chacoan system across the broader region may have been in the tens of thousands. And then, in the 12th century, things began to go wrong. The first sign was the drought. Tree ring records, which provide the most precise climate data available for this period, show a prolonged and severe drought beginning around 1130 CE that reduced rainfall across the Colorado Plateau to levels below what the Chacoan agricultural system could sustain. The cornfields began to fail. The stored surpluses, which had been carefully built up over years of good harvests, began to be drawn down. The pilgrimage gatherings, which required significant food resources to support the visitors who traveled to the canyon, became increasingly difficult to maintain. But drought alone does not explain what happened next. The Ancestral Puebloans had survived droughts before. The tree ring record shows multiple periods of reduced rainfall across the centuries of Chacoan development, and the system had adapted, adjusting agricultural practices, drawing on stored surpluses, intensifying production in the areas least affected by the drought. What appears to have been different about the drought of the 12th century was its combination with other stressors that the system was less prepared to handle. One of those stressors was internal. The Chacoan system, whatever its precise political character, had generated significant social inequality. The great houses were not the homes of ordinary farming families. They were the domains of an elite whose authority rested on their control of ritual knowledge, their access to exotic trade goods like turquoise and macaw feathers, and their ability to organize and direct the labor of others. The people who built the great houses were not necessarily the people who lived in them. The outlier communities, scattered across the plateau and connected to Chaco by the road network, provided labor and tribute that flowed toward the canyon and supported the elaboration of the great house complex. This arrangement, sustainable in times of surplus, became increasingly unstable as resources tightened. When the crops failed and the stored food ran low, the claims that the Chacoan elite made on the labor and resources of the outlier communities became harder to justify and harder to enforce. The spiritual authority that had sustained the Chacoan system began to erode as the promises implicit in that authority, abundance, order, cosmic alignment began to fail their fulfillment. Something was breaking down, not just agriculturally but socially, not just materially but spiritually, and the people who lived within the Chacoan world could feel it. By approximately 1150 CE, the great houses of Chaco Canyon were being abandoned, not all at once, not in panic, but steadily, room by room and community by community, as people made the decision to leave and seek better conditions elsewhere. The roads that had channeled the energy of an entire civilization toward this one place fell silent. The great kivas held their last ceremonies and were sealed or left open to the sky. The turquoise workshops closed. The macaws died in their cages and were buried with what appears to be considerable ceremony, their brightly colored feathers too valuable and too spiritually significant to simply discard. Where did the Chacoans go? This is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting, because the abandonment of Chaco Canyon was not the end of the ancestral Puebloan civilization. It was a transformation, a redistribution of population and energy that took the lessons and traditions and architectural knowledge of the Chacoan world and scattered them across a broader landscape. Some people moved north and west, into the canyon country of what is now southern Utah and Colorado. Some moved east toward the Rio Grande Valley. Some moved toward the mountains, where reliable rainfall and cooler temperatures offered better agricultural prospects. And some stayed relatively close, establishing new communities in the regions north and east of Chaco that would become the foundations of the post-Chacoan world. The century following the abandonment of Chaco Canyon was a period of significant population movement and cultural reorganization across the entire Colorado Plateau. New community centers emerged in the areas north of the canyon, particularly in the San Juan Basin and the Mesa Verde region of southwestern Colorado. The architectural traditions of the Chacoan world were absorbed and adapted by these successor communities. The masonry techniques, the kiva forms, the astronomical orientations, all persisting and evolving, as they were taken up by builders working in new locations with new materials and responding to new social circumstances. And it was in these successor communities, particularly in the extraordinary landscape of Mesa Verde, that the Ancestral Puebloans made the architectural decision that would most capture the imagination of later generations: the decision to move their homes into the cliffs. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are among the most visually stunning architectural achievements in the history of the world. That is not hyperbole. When you stand on the rim of Chapin Mesa in southwestern Colorado and look across the canyon to where Cliff Palace emerges from the shadows of its great alcove, its towers and walls and kiva roofs still standing after 7 centuries of abandonment, you are looking at something that goes beyond the merely impressive into the genuinely awe-inspiring. The buildings fit their setting with a perfection that seems too complete to be accidental, as if the rock itself had been waiting all along for someone to come and build exactly this structure in exactly this place. Mesa Verde, which means green table in Spanish, is a large, roughly rectangular plateau rising to about 2,600 meters above sea level in the southwestern corner of Colorado. Its flat top covered in forests of pinyon, pine and juniper, its edges dropping away in sheer cliff faces that plunge hundreds of feet to the canyon bottoms below. The canyons cut into the plateau from multiple directions, creating a landscape of interlocking mesas and deep, shadowed gorges that the Ancestral Puebloans had been farming and living in for centuries before they made the decision to move their homes from the mesa tops into the canyon walls. The alcoves, the great natural hollows eroded into the canyon walls by the slow dissolution of the Morrison and Mancos shale that underlies the Cliff House sandstone, had been used by the people of Mesa Verde for a very long time before the cliff-dwelling period. The earliest traces of human presence in the alcoves are basket maker period sites, small shelters, and storage cists tucked into the back walls of the natural overhangs, placed there precisely because the overhangs provided protection from rain and snow that was difficult to replicate with above-ground construction. Through the centuries of the early Pueblo period, the alcoves continued to be used for storage and occasional shelter, even as the primary communities remained on the mesa tops. The people knew these spaces intimately. They were not virgin territory when the great decision was made, but the decision, when it finally came, sometime in the second half of the 13th century, was still dramatic. Moving an entire community from the open mesa top into a natural alcove partway down a cliff face was not a simple logistical exercise. It required the quarrying and transport of thousands of sandstone blocks down unstable cliff faces or up from the canyon floor, the sourcing of timber for ceiling beams from forests that may have already been significantly depleted by generations of construction, the redesign of agricultural and water management systems to function from a base that was no longer adjacent to the fields, and the reorganization of daily life around the demands of living in a space where every trip to the agricultural fields required a climb up or down hundreds of feet of bare rock. Why did they do it? This is the question that every visitor to the cliff dwellings eventually asks. Standing in the shadows of Cliff Palace or Spruce Tree House or Balcony House and trying to understand what would possess a people to choose this extraordinary location for their homes, the answer that archaeologists now favor and that the evidence most strongly supports is defense. The 13th century was not a peaceful time on the Colorado Plateau. The tree ring record shows a prolonged and severe drought beginning in 1276 CE and lasting until 1299, a period of 23 years, during which rainfall was catastrophically reduced across the entire region. This was not the first drought the people of Mesa Verde had faced, but it came at the end of a long period of population growth and resource depletion that had left the system with far less resilience than it had possessed a century earlier. The forests that had supplied building timber for generations had been heavily logged. The agricultural soils on the mesa tops, after centuries of intensive farming, were exhausted and eroding. The game animals that had supplemented the agricultural diet had been hunted down to much lower population levels than they had once maintained. And the population itself, despite the pressure from previous droughts and resource depletion, remained stubbornly high, perhaps the highest it had ever been in the history of human occupation of Mesa Verde. When resources are scarce and populations are desperate, conflict follows. The archaeological evidence from the 13th century is unmistakable on this point. Throughout the Mesa Verde region and across the broader Colorado Plateau, researchers have found clear and disturbing evidence of organized violence during this period. Skeletal remains showing evidence of perimortem trauma, damage to bones inflicted at or around the time of death, including cut marks consistent with scalping and dismemberment. Burned villages, communities with their populations apparently massacred and left unburied. Sites that appear to have been deliberately destroyed rather than simply abandoned. The violence of the late 13th century on the Colorado Plateau was real. It was widespread, and it appears to have been escalating. The cliff dwellings were, among other things, fortresses. The alcoves that contained them were accessible only by routes that could be easily controlled and defended. The hand and toe hold trails cut into the cliff faces below the major cliff dwelling sites could be defended by a small number of people against a much larger attacking force. The advantages of high ground and narrow approaches, multiplying the effectiveness of defenders beyond what their actual numbers would suggest. The locations of the cliff dwellings, on the shaded north-facing walls of canyons that opened away from the primary agricultural areas on the mesa tops, suggest that they were chosen not for proximity to fields, but for defensibility. The people were pulling their homes back from exposed positions into natural fortifications. Inside the cliff dwellings, the architectural evidence supports the defensive interpretation. Many cliff dwelling sites feature check dams and walls that block access from the canyon floor. Doorways are deliberately narrow, requiring a person to turn sideways to pass through, eliminating the possibility of a rushing attack. Upper story rooms are sometimes accessible only by ladders that could be pulled up, cutting off access from below. The towers, that feature prominently at many cliff-dwelling sites, rising above the surrounding rooms to command views of the surrounding landscape, appear to have served as watchtowers, providing early warning of approaching threats. Cliff Palace, the largest and most famous of the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings, contained approximately 150 rooms and 23 kivas, suggesting a population of perhaps 100 to 150 people at its peak. It is a remarkably complex and carefully organized structure, its rooms arranged in a way that maximize the use of the available alcove space, its kivas distributed throughout the community in a pattern that reflects the social organization of the people who built it, its towers rising at strategic points to provide both structural stability and defensive advantage. Standing inside Cliff Palace today, surrounded by its walls and towers, you can feel the intelligence that went into its design, the way every element serves multiple purposes, the way the whole is somehow more than the sum of its very impressive parts. The construction of Cliff Palace and the dozens of other cliff-dwelling sites at Mesa Verde took place primarily in the last quarter of the 13th century, the same period during which the Great Drought was tightening its grip on the Colorado Plateau. The people who built these extraordinary structures were doing so under conditions of significant stress, with resources diminishing, populations under pressure, and the threat of violence a constant background to daily life. The fact that they still produced architecture of this quality under those circumstances says something important about the resilience and the aesthetic values of the culture, something that gets lost in the sometimes grim story of resource depletion and conflict. Because the cliff dwellings were not just defensive structures, they were homes, and the people who lived in them brought the full richness of their cultural life to these extraordinary spaces. The pottery produced at Mesa Verde during the cliff dwelling period reached new heights of technical and aesthetic sophistication. The distinctive Mesa Verde black-on-white style, featuring complex geometric designs of extraordinary precision, painted with yucca fiber brushes in mineral-based pigments on the white slipped surfaces of bowls and mugs and ladles. The kivas, even in the compressed and difficult circumstances of the cliff dwellings, were maintained as centers of ceremonial life, their floors bearing the marks of fire and ritual use, their walls sometimes painted with murals, whose fragments survive in protected alcoves. Music, stories, dances, the transmission of sacred knowledge from elders to children, all of this continued in the alcoves, carried on with the same commitment to cultural continuity that had sustained the people through every previous crisis. The agricultural systems that supported the cliff-dwelling communities were marvels of engineering in their own right. The people of Mesa Verde had, over centuries, developed sophisticated techniques for managing water in a landscape where it was always scarce and never predictable. They built check dams across the small drainages that cut through the mesa tops, catching the runoff from summer thunderstorms and directing it onto their agricultural fields. They terraced the sloping ground to prevent erosion and retain moisture. They identified and cultivated the specific microenvironments within the mesa landscape where soil conditions and water availability combined to create the best growing conditions, and they concentrated their agricultural effort on those spots with a precision born of generations of observation. The water management systems at Mesa Verde extended to the cliff dwellings themselves. Seeps and springs at the backs of some alcoves provided reliable water supplies that were one reason those particular locations were chosen for settlement. At other sites, the people built collection basins to catch the water that dripped from the sandstone above their homes after rains. The canals and check dams on the mesa tops continued to function even as the primary residential centers moved into the cliffs, evidence that the mesa top agricultural landscape remained in use throughout the cliff-dwelling period, the people climbing up to tend their fields by day and descending to the security of the cliff dwellings at night, or when danger threatened. The deer population of the Mesa Verde region had been under heavy hunting pressure for centuries, and by the 13th century, it was significantly reduced from its historic levels. The people responded by intensifying their turkey husbandry, raising large flocks of turkeys in pens adjacent to the cliff dwellings, and relying on them for both meat and feathers, the feathers being woven into warm blankets using a technique that the Ancestral Puebloans had developed centuries earlier. The bones of these domestic turkeys are common in the archaeological record of the cliff-dwelling period, and the evidence for large-scale turkey keeping in some communities suggests a degree of agricultural intensification that reflects the pressure the people were under to maintain food security in increasingly difficult conditions. The social world of the cliff-dwelling communities was organized around the same basic principles that had structured ancestral Puebloan society for centuries, but compressed and intensified by the circumstances of the period. The kiva remained the central institution of male social and ceremonial life, the place where the ritual business that maintained the community's relationship with the supernatural world was conducted. The lineages organized around common female ancestors that had formed the backbone of the kinship system remained the fundamental social units, their members occupying adjacent rooms in the great room blocks that made up the cliff dwellings. The community as a whole was governed by a combination of ritual authority vested in the knowledge keepers whose control of the ceremonial calendar gave them significant influence over the timing and organization of communal activities, and the authority of experience, the respect that came with age, and demonstrated competence in the skills that mattered most to the community's survival. This world, compressed into the extraordinary setting of the alcoves, persisted for approximately 2 to 3 generations, perhaps 50 to 75 years, before the final abandonment. Tree ring dates from the ceiling beams of the cliff dwellings cluster between approximately 1200 and 1280 CE for the major construction episodes, with the latest dates suggesting that building activity was still ongoing in the years immediately before the abandonment. The people who built Cliff Palace in the 1260s and 1270s were investing enormous effort in a project whose return was apparently expected to extend well into the future. There is no sign in the archaeological record that the builders knew they were constructing the last great chapter of Mesa Verde's story. And yet, by approximately 1300 CE, the cliff dwellings were empty. Not just the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, but virtually every community across the entire northern San Juan region, an area that had supported human settlement continuously for more than 2,000 years. The abandonment was not gradual in the way that the earlier Chacoan abandonment had been. It was swift, concentrated into perhaps 2 or 3 decades, leaving behind communities that appeared in some cases to have been walked away from in the middle of daily life. Pottery left in rooms, food stored in granaries but never retrieved, grinding stones still bearing the dust of the last batch of corn they processed. Why? Why, after surviving droughts before, after adapting to the loss of Chaco Canyon, after building the extraordinary cliff dwellings as fortresses against the violence of the 13th century, did the people finally leave? The answer, as with so many questions about this civilization, is not simple. It was the combination of stressors, all reaching their peaks simultaneously, that finally tipped the balance past the point where adaptation was possible. The drought of 1276 to 1299 was the most severe, and prolonged the region had experienced in at least 300 years. The tree ring record from that period shows not just reduced rainfall, but a near-complete failure of the summer monsoon rains that the agricultural system of the northern San Juan region depended on most critically. Without those rains, the corn simply did not grow. The check dams and terraces, and carefully managed microclimates that had allowed the people to farm successfully through previous dry periods could not compensate for a 23-year failure of the rains. The stored surpluses were exhausted. The turkeys, which required grain to supplement their forage, began to die. The deer, already reduced by centuries of hunting, retreated to higher elevations, where the impact of the drought was less severe, but where the ancestral Puebloans could not easily follow. At the same time, the violence that had driven the people into the cliff dwellings was not abating. The evidence for conflict in the archaeological record of the late 13th century is, if anything, more concentrated and more severe than in the earlier decades. Massacres sites, whose dates cluster in the 1270s and 1280s, suggest that the conflict was intensifying, even as the resources available to support it were diminishing. This is not a paradox. Desperate people fighting over inadequate resources are capable of extraordinary violence, and the Mesa Verde region, in the last decades of the 13th century, presents a picture of communities under existential stress that were simultaneously starving and fighting. And there was another factor, one that is difficult to quantify archaeologically, but that the traditions of the descendant Pueblo peoples treat as centrally important: spiritual failure. The ancestral Puebloan ceremonial system was not separate from the practical world of agriculture and subsistence. It was deeply embedded in that world, its rituals timed to the agricultural calendar, its prayers and dances directed toward the goal of bringing rain, ensuring good harvests, maintaining the cosmic balance that made human life possible. When the rains failed year after year, when the crops withered and the stored food ran out and the violence escalated, the failure was not just agricultural or political, it was spiritual. The ceremonies were not working. The relationship between the human community and the spiritual forces that governed the natural world had been disrupted, and the disruption could not be repaired through more ceremony, because the conditions that made ceremony meaningful and effective had themselves been compromised. The oral traditions of the Hopi, Zuni, and various Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, all of whom trace their ancestry to the ancestral Puebloans of the northern San Juan region, speak of this period in terms that emphasize spiritual crisis and the necessity of movement as a spiritual remedy. The stories do not describe the abandonment of the cliff dwellings as a defeat or an escape from catastrophe. They describe it as a fulfillment, as the completion of a migration that the people had always known they were meant to make, a movement from one stage of their sacred journey toward the next. Whether we understand this framing as literally true or as a cultural interpretation imposed retrospectively on events that were experienced very differently in the moment, it speaks to something important about the ancestral Puebloan worldview. For these people, movement was not failure. It was often, in the right circumstances, exactly the right response to a world that had changed beyond the point where staying made sense. The departure from the northern San Juan region in the last decades of the 13th century was organized and deliberate. This was not a panicked flight. The people took their most valued possessions with them. They carefully sealed their seed stores, perhaps intending to return, or perhaps wanting to ensure that anyone who came after them would find food for a new beginning. They conducted closing ceremonies in their kivas, ritually decommissioning the sacred spaces before they left them. Some structures appear to have been deliberately burned as part of a closing ceremony, a final offering to the spirits of the place before the community departed, and then they walked south and east, and in some cases southwest, following routes that led them out of the canyon country and into new landscapes where they would build new communities and eventually become the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples who live in the southwest today. The migration out of the northern San Juan region at the end of the 13th century was not a single event. It was a process, extending over perhaps 2 or 3 decades, involving tens of thousands of people moving in different directions toward different destinations. The archaeological record of this period is marked by what researchers describe as a dramatic reorganization of population, a redistribution of people that transformed the demographic landscape of the entire American Southwest within the space of a single human lifetime. Some of the most revealing evidence for this migration comes not from where the people went, but from what they left behind. The communities of the northern San Juan region were not abandoned uniformly or simultaneously. The tree ring dates from different sites show that some communities were vacated before others, suggesting a staggered departure in which the first to leave may have been the most mobile, the communities under the greatest immediate stress, or the ones with the strongest connections to potential destination areas. The last communities to be abandoned appear to have held on into the 1290s, after the Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 was already well underway, which raises the question of what kept them there as long as they stayed, and what finally convinced them to go. The destinations of the migrants are documented both in the archaeological record, through the appearance of Mesa Verde, ceramic styles and architectural traditions in areas that had not previously seen them, and in the oral traditions of the descendant communities, which preserve memories of migration routes and stopping places that have, in some cases, been confirmed by archaeological investigation. The picture that emerges is one of organized, purposeful movement towards specific destinations that were known and had been scouted in advance, rather than desperate flight in random directions. Many of the migrants from the Mesa Verde region moved south into the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, where they joined or established communities that eventually became the ancestors of the eastern Pueblo peoples, including the Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, and Keresan language groups, whose descendants still live in the Rio Grande Valley today. The dramatic influx of population into the Rio Grande Valley that is visible in the archaeological record of the late 13th and early 14th centuries transformed the region from a sparsely inhabited hinterland into one of the most densely populated areas in the pre-Columbian Southwest, with large, aggregated communities containing hundreds and eventually thousands of rooms, replacing the smaller, more scattered settlements of the previous period. Other migrants moved southwest into the high plateau country of what is now northeastern Arizona, where they joined the communities that would eventually coalesce into the Hopi people. The Hopi mesas, rising above the painted desert in a landscape of extraordinary stark beauty, became one of the major receiving areas for migrants from the northern regions, and the Hopi cultural tradition preserves memories of these migrations in its clan histories, which record the journeys of specific clans from their places of origin in the north and west to their eventual arrival at the Hopi mesas and their incorporation into the existing community there. Still others moved toward the Zuni River Valley of western New Mexico, where the ancestors of the Zuni people were establishing the large, aggregated communities that would eventually become the modern Pueblo of Zuni. The Zuni oral tradition, like that of the Hopi, preserves extensive memories of migration, of the long journey that the people undertook before finding the place where they were meant to settle, the center of the world that they had been told they would recognize when they reached it. The movement of population into these destination areas was not always smooth or peaceful. The areas that received the migrants from the northern San Juan region were not empty. They had their own indigenous populations, with their own agricultural systems, their own water rights, their own social and spiritual organizations. The arrival of large numbers of migrants from the north, bringing their own cultural traditions and their own claims to land and resources, created tensions that are visible in the archaeological record as periods of conflict and competition in the early 14th century. But the integration also brought benefits. The migrants from the north brought with them the accumulated technological and cultural knowledge of centuries of ancestral Puebloan civilization, including sophisticated agricultural techniques, advanced masonry skills, the kiva-centered ceremonial system, and the complex astronomical and calendrical knowledge encoded in the architecture and ritual traditions of the Chacoan and Mesa Verde periods. This knowledge was valuable to the communities they joined, and its incorporation into the local cultural traditions helped to produce the synthesis that would eventually become the mature Pueblo culture of the historic period. The aggregation of population into large, nucleated communities that is the most visible demographic trend of the early 14th century had profound effects on ancestral Puebloan social organization. The small, dispersed communities of the earlier periods had been organized primarily around kinship, with extended family groups occupying adjacent rooms in relatively small room blocks and managing their own agricultural plots and ceremonial activities within a loose framework of community cooperation. The large, aggregated communities of the 14th century brought together hundreds of people from multiple different kinship groups, speaking in some cases different dialects or even different languages, carrying different ceremonial traditions and different understandings of the social order. Making these diverse groups function as a coherent community required new forms of social organization, new mechanisms for managing conflict, distributing resources, and maintaining the ceremonial life that was the spiritual foundation of community existence. The solutions that the ancestral Puebloans developed in response to these challenges were creative and various, drawing on existing traditions while innovating in ways that the specific circumstances demanded. The moiety system, in which the community was divided into two complementary halves that shared responsibility for different aspects of ceremonial life and governance, appears to have become more elaborated and more central to community organization in this period. The Kachina religion, which would eventually become the defining ceremonial tradition of most Pueblo peoples, appears to have emerged or dramatically expanded in influence during the 14th and 15th centuries, perhaps as a response to the social challenges of integration, providing a shared spiritual framework that could encompass diverse kinship groups within a single community. The Kachina religion, whatever its specific origins, was a profoundly integrative force. The Kachinas, spiritual beings who were understood as the intermediaries between the human world and the supernatural forces that governed rain, fertility, and the order of the cosmos. They were associated with specific clans and ceremonial societies, but were also shared across the entire community in the public dances and ceremonies where masked performers impersonated the Kachinas and brought their power directly into the Kaun's human world. The dances were simultaneously religious ceremonies and social occasions, moments when the entire community came together to experience the spiritual reality that underlay and gave meaning to their shared life. In communities composed of diverse kinship groups with different histories and traditions, the shared experience of the Kachina ceremonies provided a common cultural foundation that was essential to social cohesion. The agricultural systems of the 14th and 15th century communities continued to evolve in response to the specific conditions of their new locations. In the Rio Grande Valley, the availability of permanent water in the Rio Grande and its tributaries allowed the development of irrigation agriculture on a scale that had not been possible in the Canyon country, where reliance on rainfall and runoff had imposed firm limits on agricultural intensity. The irrigation systems, developed by the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, were sophisticated networks of canals and headgates that allowed precise control of water distribution across large agricultural areas, enabling the production of crop yields substantially higher than anything that had been achieved in the northern San Juan region. This agricultural intensification supported the large populations of the Rio Grande Valley Pueblos, which in some cases contained several thousand inhabitants, making them among the largest communities in the pre-Columbian Southwest. On the Hopi Mesas, where the agricultural conditions were more challenging, the people developed different solutions. The Hopi dry farming tradition, which has been described by agricultural historians as one of the most sophisticated systems of dryland farming ever developed, relied on an extraordinarily detailed understanding of the local environment to identify and exploit the specific microenvironments where crops could be grown successfully without irrigation. The particular combination of sandy soil, subsurface moisture from winter snowmelt, and afternoon shade, provided by specific geological features, created growing conditions that the Hopi recognized and cultivated with a precision that allowed successful harvests in years when any other farming system would have failed. The Hopi developed specialized varieties of corn adapted to these conditions, with deep root systems that could access soil moisture at depths unreachable by most cultivars, with short growing seasons that could mature before the early frosts of the high desert autumn, with drought tolerance built in through generations of selection by farmers who understood that the ability to produce even a small yield in a bad year was more valuable than the ability to produce a large yield only in good years. This agricultural knowledge, accumulated over centuries of farming in the most demanding conditions on the continent, was one of the Ancestral Puebloans' most extraordinary achievements, invisible to the casual observer, but as sophisticated in its way as the masonry of Cliff Palace or the astronomical alignments of Chaco Canyon. The period from approximately 1300 to 1540 CE, the 2.5 centuries between the abandonment of the northern San Juan region and the arrival of the first Spanish explorers in the southwest, was a period of continued adaptation and cultural elaboration for the descendant Pueblo peoples. The large aggregated communities of the early 14th century underwent their own cycles of growth and consolidation, some communities proving more successful than others, some locations proving more productive than others, the overall population shifting in response to environmental and social pressures in ways that left the Pueblo world of the mid-16th century significantly different in its geography from what it had been 2 centuries earlier. The ceramic traditions continued to evolve, producing in different regions some of the most technically and aesthetically accomplished pottery of the pre-Columbian world. The Sikyatki polychrome pottery of the Hopi Mesas, produced in the 15th and 16th centuries, features curvilinear designs of extraordinary fluidity and complexity, painted in multiple colors on forms that represent a complete departure from the angular geometric traditions of the earlier periods, a creative revolution that speaks to a culture fully at ease with its artistic traditions and willing to take them in bold new directions. The Rio Grande glazeware traditions of the same period, using lead-based glazes to produce richly colored decorative surfaces on bowls and jars, represent another flowering of ceramic art, whose quality was recognized even by the Spanish conquistadors who arrived to find it. The architecture of the 14th and 15th century Pueblo communities reflected the social priorities of the post-migration period. The large room blocks of the Rio Grande Pueblos were organized around open plazas that served as the primary public spaces of the community. The locations where the kachina dances and other public ceremonies were performed, where community business was conducted, where the social life of the community unfolded in the daily rhythms of work and conversation and play. The kivas, now more standardized in their form and more clearly associated with specific clan or ceremonial society groups, were distributed throughout the community in a pattern that reflected the social organization of their users. The defensive features of the earlier period, the watchtowers and narrow doorways and restricted access points, were gradually relaxed as the violence of the 13th century receded into memory and the integrated communities of the 14th and 15th centuries developed the social mechanisms needed to manage conflict internally. The 14th and 15th centuries also saw the continued development of the long-distance trade networks that had been one of the defining features of ancestral Puebloan civilization since the Chacoan period. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, the Hopi Mesas, and the Zuni region were connected to each other and to the communities of the Mexican Northwest, and ultimately to the civilizations of Mesoamerica by trade routes that moved copper bells and macaw feathers and cacao and cotton northward, and turquoise and pottery and shell ornaments southward. These trade connections brought not just goods, but ideas, and the ceremonial innovations of the 14th and 15th centuries show clear evidence of Mesoamerican influence, particularly in the iconography of the Kachina religion, and in the elaboration of certain ritual practices. And then, in 1540, everything changed again, in ways that would dwarf even the disruptions of the late 13th century. The arrival of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado and his expedition of 300 Spanish soldiers and 1,000 Mexican Indian allies in the summer of 1540 marked the beginning of a new era whose effects the Pueblo peoples are still living with today. Coronado had come looking for the legendary 7 cities of gold, the Cibola that Spanish rumor had placed somewhere in the far north of the continent, cities whose wealth was supposed to rival that of the Aztec Empire that Hernán Cortés had conquered only 20 years earlier. What he found instead were the pueblos of Zuni and the Rio Grande Valley, impressive certainly, with their multi-story room blocks and their plazas full of people and their storerooms full of food, but distinctly lacking in the gold and silver and precious gems that the Spanish crown's treasury required. The encounter between Coronado's expedition and the Pueblo peoples was disastrous. The Spanish, frustrated by the absence of the riches they had expected and arrogant with the confidence of a military technology that the Pueblo peoples could not match, responded to any resistance or perceived insult with overwhelming violence. The massacre at the Tiwa Pueblo of Arenal in the winter of 1540 to 1541, in which Spanish soldiers burned a community and killed perhaps 200 people who had initially been induced to surrender on a promise of peaceful treatment, set the tone for the relationship between the Spanish colonizers and the Pueblo peoples for the next century and a half. The formal colonization of New Mexico began in 1598 with the expedition of Juan de Oñate, who established the first permanent Spanish settlement in the upper Rio Grande Valley and claimed sovereignty over all the Pueblo peoples in the name of the Spanish crown. The following 80 years were a time of extraordinary suffering for the Pueblo peoples. The Spanish colonial system extracted tribute in the form of labor and agricultural produce from the Pueblo communities, requiring the people to work for the colonists and the missions while still maintaining their own fields to feed their own families. The Catholic missions, built in or adjacent to almost every Pueblo community during this period, required enormous amounts of forced labor to construct and maintained continuous pressure on the Pueblo ceremonial life, attempting to suppress the Kachina dances and other traditional religious practices that the Franciscan missionaries regarded as devil worship. The response of the Pueblo peoples to this pressure was a combination of resistance and accommodation that speaks to the same adaptive intelligence that had allowed their ancestors to survive the challenges of the canyon country. Some aspects of the traditional ceremonial life were driven underground, conducted in secret in the kivas, while the public face of the community maintained a nominal Catholic observance. The ceramic traditions continued, finding new forms and new markets in the colonial economy, while maintaining the aesthetic traditions that linked the potters of the 17th century to their ancestral Puebloan predecessors. The agricultural systems continued to function, adapted to include the new crops and domestic animals that the Spanish introduced, the sheep and cattle and horses and wheat and chili peppers that would become central to Pueblo life. But the suffering was real, and it accumulated. Epidemics of European diseases to which the Pueblo peoples had no immunity swept through the communities repeatedly, each wave reducing populations that had no time to recover before the next arrived. The population of the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, estimated at perhaps 60,000 at the time of Spanish contact, had fallen to perhaps 17,000 by 1680. Drought returned in the 1660s and 1670s, adding famine to the burdens of epidemic disease and colonial exploitation. The Spanish response to the Pueblo people's attempts to conduct their traditional ceremonies intensified in the same period, culminating in 1675 with the public flogging and imprisonment of 47 Pueblo religious leaders accused of witchcraft. This last provocation proved to be the catalyst for the most dramatic act of collective resistance in the history of the Pueblo peoples. In August of 1680, a unified force of warriors from virtually every Pueblo community in New Mexico, led by a Tewa religious leader from Owinge named Pope, rose simultaneously against the Spanish colonists in what became known as the Pueblo Revolt. The coordination required to organize warriors from 24 separate Pueblo communities, speaking at least 6 different languages, to act simultaneously against a well-armed colonial force in the middle of a landscape spread across hundreds of miles, was a logistical and diplomatic achievement of the highest order. The revolt killed approximately 400 Spanish colonists and 21 missionaries, and drove the remaining 2,000 survivors south to El Paso del Norte in what is now the Texas-Mexico border region. For 12 years, from 1680 to 1692, the Pueblo peoples governed themselves without Spanish interference for the first time in 80 years. The Spanish reconquest of New Mexico, under Diego de Vargas in 1692, reimposed colonial rule. But the relationship between the colonizers and the Pueblo peoples was permanently changed by the revolt. The most egregious abuses of the pre-revolt period were not repeated. The tribute demands were moderated. The suppression of traditional ceremonies was relaxed. The Pueblo peoples were allowed to practice their own religion alongside the Catholic faith that the missions continued to promote. And they did so, developing over the following centuries a distinctive religious synthesis that combined elements of both traditions in ways that the practitioners understood as consistent with their own cultural values. This is the world that exists today, in the 20 pueblos of New Mexico and the Hopi villages of Arizona, communities that trace their ancestry directly to the ancestral Puebloans of the Canyon country, carrying traditions that stretch back through the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and the great houses of Chaco Canyon to the basket maker farmers and the archaic foragers who first learnt to read the desert landscape 10,000 years ago. The word Anasazi, which we have used throughout this telling, requires a final word of explanation. It is a Navajo word that has been translated variously as ancient enemies, ancestors of our enemies, or ancient ones who are not us. Its use as a general term for the ancestral Puebloan peoples has been controversial for decades among both archaeologists and the descendant communities themselves, who prefer the term Ancestral Puebloans precisely because it acknowledges the living continuity between the cliff dwellers of the 13th century and the Pueblo peoples of today. The people did not disappear. They did not vanish mysteriously into the desert. They made choices, difficult and painful choices, forced by circumstances they could not fully control, and they walked south and east and found new places to live and new ways to be who they had always been. Their descendants are alive today, and they carry within their traditions and their practices and their relationship to the land a knowledge that extends back further than most civilizations on the planet. This matters. It matters because the story of the ancestral Puebloans is too often told as a story of disappearance and failure, as if the abandonment of the cliff dwellings was the end of something rather than a transformation, as if the remarkable achievements of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde were simply wiped out by drought and conflict and left as monuments to a civilization that could not survive. This is the wrong story. The right story is one of extraordinary resilience, of a people who adapted and adapted and adapted, again, across 10,000 years of occupation in one of the most challenging environments on the continent, who built things of transcendent beauty under conditions of profound difficulty, who carried their cultural traditions intact through every crisis, and who are still here, still farming the same landscapes, still conducting the same ceremonies, still making pottery in the same traditions, still living in the shadow of the same mountain ranges that their ancestors looked out at from the windows of their cliff dwellings 700 years ago. The abandonment of the cliff dwellings was not the end. It was a chapter in a story that has no end. A story that is still being written in the language of corn and clay and ceremony by the descendants of the people who looked out from Cliff Palace across the canyon country of southwestern Colorado and understood, finally, that it was time to go somewhere else. There is something else about this story that deserves to be told slowly and carefully. Something that gets lost when we focus exclusively on the grand narrative of civilizational rise and fall and migration. That something is the texture of ordinary life inside the cliff dwellings and the great houses, the daily rhythms of a people who were not simply historical actors in a story about drought and conflict, but human beings living human lives in one of the most beautiful and demanding landscapes on Earth. If we are going to understand what was lost when the cliff dwellings were abandoned, and what was preserved when the people carried their traditions south and east into new homelands, we need to spend some time inside the rooms, at the grinding stones, beside the hearths, in the kivas, learning what it was actually like to be alive in this world. Waking up in a cliff dwelling began before dawn. The eastern horizon over the canyon was still dark, the stars still sharp and clear in the high desert air when the first movements of the day began. The sound of a child crying in an adjacent room, the smell of a fire being coaxed back to life from the banked coals of the previous night. The cold of the canyon, which at this elevation and in this season could be genuinely bitter, hanging in the air of the stone rooms despite the fire. The walls of the rooms were plastered with a smooth coating of clay that had been mixed with fine sand and sometimes with ground pottery sherds to give it body, and they held the warmth of the previous day's sun better than bare stone, but not so much better that you did not feel the cold when you pulled yourself out of your sleeping mat in the hour before sunrise. The sleeping mats themselves were beautifully made, woven from strips of rabbit fur twisted around a core of plant fiber, and then interlaced in a pattern that created a warm, flexible sleeping surface significantly more comfortable than bare stone. The rabbit fur robes that served as blankets were similarly sophisticated in their construction, using a technique in which fresh rabbit skins were twisted into spirals and then woven together to create a garment whose loft and insulation rivaled anything that could have been achieved with textile weaving. In the coldest months, when the canyon was in shadow for most of the day and the nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing, these robes were essential to survival. People slept fully clothed, wrapped in their robes, sometimes with a sleeping dog pressed against them for additional warmth. The first task of the morning was water. In cliff dwellings with reliable springs at the back of the alcove, this was simply a matter of filling the ceramic water jars from the spring and carrying them to wherever they were needed. In communities without reliable water sources in the alcove itself, someone, usually a young woman or an older child, had to descend the cliff face with water jars balanced in a carrying basket, make their way to the nearest water source, fill the jars, and climb back up. This task, performed every morning, required the kind of casual athleticism that came only from growing up in the cliff dwellings, where the hand and toe-hold trails carved into the canyon walls were as familiar as a staircase to an adult, but genuinely dangerous to anyone not trained from childhood. The water jars used for this task were typically the smaller, more utilitarian vessels of the cliff-dwelling ceramic tradition, round-bottomed jars with narrow necks that minimized spillage and with a surface finish that allowed them to be gripped securely, even with wet hands. The morning meal was simple. Corn was the foundation of everything. The people of the cliff-dwelling period grew many different varieties of corn, selected and developed over generations to optimize for the specific conditions of their agricultural environment, varieties that matured at different rates to spread the harvest season across a longer period. Varieties that produced larger or smaller kernels in different ratios of starch to protein. Varieties adapted to different elevations and soil types. This diversity was itself a form of agricultural risk management, ensuring that at least some varieties would produce reasonable yields in any particular year, regardless of the specific weather conditions. The corn was stored in the back rooms of the cliff dwellings after the harvest, packed into large storage jars and sealed with clay, the careful management of the stored surplus being one of the critical tasks of the community's agricultural year. To make the morning meal, the dried corn kernels were first soaked in water to soften them, then processed through a series of grinding stones, metates, of progressively finer grain that reduced the kernels first to a coarse meal and then to a smooth, fine flour. The grinding stones were arranged in a row, the coarsest at one end and the finest at the other, and the grinding was done from coarsest to finest in sequence. Each passed through the metates, reducing the particle size further until the final flour was smooth enough for the flatbreads and porridges that constituted the primary foods of the cliff-dwelling diet. The grinding was women's work in the gendered division of labor of the ancestral Puebloan world, and it was hard, repetitive, physical labor that occupied significant portions of the day and left its mark in the skeletal remains of women from cliff-dwelling communities, whose knee joints and spinal vertebrae show the characteristic wear patterns of people who spent many hours each day kneeling before the grinding stones. The grinding was also social. Women ground together in groups, working side by side at their metates, while they talked and sang and told stories. The rhythmic sound of the manos moving back and forth over the stone surfaces, providing a kind of percussive backdrop to the conversations of the day. Songs specific to the grinding process. Grinding songs that matched their rhythm to the motion of the work and that served as a kind of meditation on the labor, were an important part of the women's cultural tradition of the cliff-dwelling period. Some of these songs survive in the ceremonial traditions of the descendant Pueblo peoples, preserved across 7 centuries because they were too beautiful and too important to let go. The flatbreads made from the ground corn were cooked on flat sandstone slabs heated over the fire, their thin surfaces patterned with the marks of the stone they were cooked on, their texture somewhere between a tortilla and a crepe. They were eaten with dried meat, or dried berries, or roasted seeds, or sometimes simply alone, dipped in stew or wrapped around a filling of beans or squash. Beans were cooked in the large cooking pots that were the most utilitarian class of ancestral Puebloan ceramics, simple vessels with thick walls and stable flat bottoms that could sit directly on the coals of the fire and simmer for hours without cracking. Squash, roasted in the coals or boiled into a simple soup, provided sweetness and variety. When the hunting had been good, deer or rabbit or turkey added protein and fat that made the difference between adequate nourishment and the marginal nutrition of a diet based almost entirely on plant foods. The men's day was organized around a different set of tasks. Farming occupied most of the growing season, from the planting in late spring through the cultivation and harvesting that extended into the fall. The agricultural plots were sometimes quite far from the cliff-dwelling communities, particularly in areas where the most productive agricultural soils were located on the mesa tops above the cliff faces, requiring the farmers to make the ascent each morning and the descent each evening. The farming itself was intensive and attentive work, the fields requiring constant care to manage the limited moisture available, to control the weeds that competed with the crops, to protect the young plants from the insects and birds that regarded an agricultural field as a concentrated food source. When they were not farming, the men were hunting, or making and repairing the tools and equipment that daily life required. The hunting was done with bow and arrow, the atlatl and dart having been gradually replaced by the bow during the earlier basket-maker period, and the bow and arrow used by the cliff-dwelling hunters were sophisticated weapons whose performance approached that of medieval European crossbows. The bows were made from juniper or other local woods that had been carefully selected for their combination of flexibility and stiffness, reinforced sometimes with sinew backing that dramatically increased their power and range. The arrows were fletched with feathers obtained from the turkeys that the community kept in pens, their heads tipped with carefully napped chert or obsidian points that the best nappers could produce to extraordinary levels of sharpness and precision. Hunting in the canyon country of the 13th century required a deep knowledge of the landscape and the animals that inhabited it. The deer and bighorn sheep that were the primary large game animals were not plentiful, their populations reduced by centuries of hunting pressure, and finding them required the patience to wait at water sources and the knowledge to read the signs of their presence in the landscape. Rabbit drives, in which an entire community participated in driving rabbits into a net strung across the mouth of a canyon, were both an important food-gathering activity and a social occasion, one of the times when the entire community came together in a shared task that was simultaneously practical and recreational. The making of pottery was another significant occupation of the cliff-dwelling period, and the pottery produced at Mesa Verde during the 13th century represents one of the high points of ancestral Puebloan ceramic art. The potters worked without a wheel, building their vessels by hand, using the coiling and scraping technique that had been the foundation of southwestern pottery making since its introduction from the south approximately 2,000 years earlier. Coils of clay were built up on a base and then thinned and smoothed by scraping with a gourd or potsherd, the walls growing thinner and more even with each pass of the scraper until they achieved the remarkable thinness and uniformity that characterizes the finest Mesa Verde black-on-white vessels. The pots were then dried slowly in the shade, sanded to remove any irregularities in the surface, coated with a white clay slip, decorated with the complex geometric designs that are the signature of the Mesa Verde ceramic tradition, and finally fired in the open air in carefully constructed oxidizing fires that produce the distinctive carbon black on white surface that gives the style its name. The geometric designs, painted on Mesa Verde black on white pottery, are worth dwelling on for a moment, because they reveal something important about the aesthetic world of the cliff-dwelling people. The designs are not random or purely decorative in the sense of being arbitrary. They are organized according to principles of symmetry and proportion that are consistent across thousands of individual vessels, suggesting that the potters were working within a shared visual grammar that was taught and learned and carried a significance beyond simple visual pleasure. The specific geometric motifs, the stepped elements, the interlocking spirals, the checkerboard patterns, the fine line hatching, appear also in the architecture and in the rock art and in the woven textiles of the period, suggesting that they were part of a unified visual language through which the culture expressed its understanding of the order of the cosmos, its relationship to the spiritual world, its identity as a community with a shared history and shared values. The evening meals were the most social times of the day, the moment when the community gathered in the larger rooms or around the fires in the kivas to eat and talk and tell stories. The children, who had spent the day in the company of the adults who were not out farming or hunting, playing in the alcove spaces between the room blocks, watching the adults at their various tasks, learning by observation and imitation the skills they would need as adults, were part of these gatherings. The stories told in the evenings were both entertainment and education. The traditional narratives that encoded the community's history, its cosmology, its ethical framework, its understanding of how the world worked and what human beings owed to each other and to the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. The telling of these stories was not casual, it was a skilled art, and the best storytellers were respected members of the community whose gift for narrative was recognized as a form of knowledge, as valuable as skill at hunting or excellence at farming. The nights in the cliff dwellings were extraordinarily dark by modern standards. The only light came from the fires in the rooms and kivas, whose flickering orange light threw dramatic shadows across the plastered walls and gave the space an intimacy and warmth that the stone and mortar construction might otherwise have lacked. In the summer, when the days were long and hot, and the canyon was filled with the sound of cicadas, the nights were cooler and pleasant, and people gathered outside on the narrow ledges and terraces that fronted the cliff dwellings to enjoy the relief of the night air and the spectacular star-filled sky that presented itself above the canyon walls. The Milky Way, invisible to most modern observers under the light pollution of contemporary civilization, blazed across the canyon sky with a brilliance that made the astronomical traditions of the Ancestral Puebloans entirely comprehensible. If you can see every star in the sky with naked eye clarity every clear night of your life, you become intimate with the sky in ways that are difficult to imagine if you have spent your life under the orange glow of city lights. The kivas were the hearts of the cliff-dwelling communities, the spaces where the men gathered for the ritual activities that sustained the community's relationship with the spiritual world. The physical structure of the kiva was itself a symbolic representation of the ancestral Puebloan cosmology. The circular form, referenced the shape of the world. The central hearth represented the fire that was given to human beings by the spiritual forces at the beginning of time. The ventilator shaft that brought fresh air into the kiva from outside represented the breath of the world, the constant exchange between the interior human space and the exterior natural world that was necessary for life. The sipapu, the small round hole in the floor near the hearth that appears in kivas throughout the ancestral Puebloan world, represented the place of emergence, the portal through which the ancestors had come up into this world from the previous world below. The ceremonies conducted in the kivas were complex, carefully scripted events that required extensive preparation and specialized knowledge. The participants, typically the initiated men of the community, organized into the ceremonial societies that managed different aspects of the ritual calendar, prepared for the ceremonies by fasting, by sexual abstinence, by the making of prayer sticks and other ritual objects, by the rehearsal of the songs and prayers and dances that the ceremony required. The preparation could extend over days or weeks for the major ceremonies, the investment of time and effort reflecting the importance that the community placed on getting the ceremony right. The ritual year was organized around the movements of the sun, whose return after the winter solstice and whose maximum power at the summer solstice marked the most important points in the ceremonial calendar. Between these solar landmarks, the year was filled with a succession of ceremonies tied to the agricultural cycle, the planting in spring, the growing season in summer, the harvest in fall, each ceremony directed toward the goal of maintaining the cosmic order that allowed human life to continue. The ceremonies were not requests made to benevolent deities by supplicating humans. They were collaborative acts of creation in which the human participants, through their correct performance of the rituals, contributed to the maintenance of a cosmic order that required human participation to function. This understanding of the relationship between human beings and the spiritual world is one of the most distinctive features of the ancestral Puebloan tradition, and it helps to explain why the spiritual dimension of the late 13th century crisis was so significant. If the ceremonies were not just prayers, but necessary contributions to the maintenance of the cosmic order, then their failure to produce the expected results was not just disappointing, but cosmically alarming. It meant that the order itself was disrupted, that something had gone wrong at a level deeper than the agricultural or the political. It meant that the community's relationship with the spiritual world had been compromised in a fundamental way, and that the restoration of that relationship required more than additional ceremonies. It might require movement, a return to the pattern of migration that the ancestral Puebloan traditions described as the proper mode of human existence. The constant movement in search of the center, the heart of the world, the place where human beings were meant to be. The understanding of the abandonment as spiritual necessity rather than material defeat is not just a retrospective rationalization by descendant communities looking for a dignified way to explain what happened to their ancestors. It is consistent with what we know about the ancestral Puebloan worldview, with the evidence from the closing ceremonies conducted at the cliff-dwelling sites before their abandonment, and with the oral traditions that describe the migrations of the 13th century in terms of purposeful journey rather than desperate flight. The people who left the cliff dwellings were not admitting failure. They were fulfilling a destiny. This perspective changes the way we think about the physical remains they left behind. The rooms sealed with mud plaster, the granaries still holding seed corn, the kivas carefully decommissioned before departure. These are not the traces of people who ran away. They are the traces of people who completed one chapter and prepared the way for whatever was to come next, whether that was a return of the community itself, a possibility that some clearly kept open, or the arrival of future people who would find what was left behind and understand that it was offered in a spirit of continuity, of connection across time, of recognition that the land and its buildings outlast any particular group of people who live there. The canyon country itself has outlasted the cliff dwellers by 7 centuries now, and it will outlast us all by many more. The great alcoves still hold the buildings that were constructed within them with such care and skill and artistic ambition. The sandstone walls still bear the pale ghost outlines of the plaster that was applied to them, still show in places the painted surfaces that decorated the rooms where families lived and ate and argued and loved and raised children and grew old. The kivas are open to the sky now, their roofs long gone, but their sipapu holes are still visible in the floors, the small round portals through which the ancestors came up into the world and through which the prayers of the living still travel down. When you walk through Cliff Palace or Pueblo Bonito today, you are walking through a place where something profound happened, where a civilization that had been building itself for 1,000 years reached its fullest expression, and then, in the space of a generation, reorganized itself and moved on to become something new. The silence of those rooms is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of things that have been said completely, of stories that have been told to their proper endings, of lives that were lived as fully as the circumstances allowed and then yielded, as all lives must, to the lives that came after. The descendants of the people who built these rooms are still here, in the plazas of the Rio Grande pueblos, in the ceremonies of the Hopi villages, in the pottery traditions and the farming traditions and the ceremonial traditions that carry within them, encoded in their forms and their rhythms and their meanings, the memory of 10,000 years of human life on the Colorado Plateau. They did not disappear. They are, in the fullest sense of that word, still here. The story of the Anasazi, the Ancestral Puebloans, is not a mystery. It is not a puzzle to be solved or a disappearance to be explained. It is a story of people, fully human people, with all the complexity and richness and difficulty that human life entails, who lived in an extraordinary place and built extraordinary things and faced extraordinary challenges and responded to those challenges with resilience and creativity and cultural commitment that allowed them to carry everything that mattered across whatever distances they had to travel to find the next place where their lives could continue. The cliff dwellings are empty now, but the people are not gone. They were never gone. And the canyon country, that vast, silent, beautiful landscape of red rock and sage and enormous sky, holds the memory of their presence in every hand and toe hold trail cut into its walls, in every check dam built across its drainage channels, in every grinding stone smoothed by the patient work of hands that turned corn into the food that sustained a civilization across 1,000 years. The memory is in the rock itself, in the places where the stone was shaped and fitted and built into something that has outlasted every other human structure from its era on the continent. It is in the shadows of the alcoves, where the light falls in the same angles that it fell when the rooms were full of people going about the business of their lives. If you could stand in one of those alcoves at dawn, as the first light began to catch the top of the opposite canyon wall, and the shadows slowly retreated from the room blocks below, you might understand something about why the people built here that no amount of archaeological explanation quite captures. The quality of the light in those canyons in the early morning is unlike anything else. It is ancient light, light that has been falling on the same sandstone for hundreds of millions of years, that has been warming the same south-facing walls since long before human beings existed to notice it. In that light, the cliff dwellings look not like ruins, but like what they are, places where people lived, where children were born, and old people died, and the ceremonies of the community were conducted year after year, in the belief that doing so kept the world in order. That belief was not wrong, not in the ways that matter most. The world is still here, the canyons are still here, the descendants of the people who built the cliff dwellings are still here, carrying the traditions that connect them to their ancestors across 7 centuries of transformation and adaptation and survival. The story is not over. It has never been over. It is simply continuing, as stories do, in forms that its earlier chapters could not have anticipated, but that carry within them, if you know how to read them, the unmistakable signature of the people who began it. The canyon holds everything, holds the memory of the first people who walked down from the highlands and looked at the land and decided to stay, holds the memory of the baskets and the pit houses and the first tentative experiments with corn, holds the memory of the great houses rising against the desert sky and the roads stretching away in all directions and the kivas humming with ceremony, holds the memory of the drought and the violence and the difficult decision to leave, holds the memory of the people walking south through the landscape they knew better than anyone who has lived there since, carrying their seeds and their pottery and their stories and their songs and their understanding of how the world works and what human beings owe to each other and to the land and to the sky. They walked out of the canyon country and they carried the canyon with them. That is what really happened to the cliff dwellers. Not a disappearance, not a mystery, not a collapse, a carrying forward, a continuation, a story that is, in the most important sense, still being told. The night is quiet now. The desert sky beyond these canyon walls holds all the stars that the people of Cliff Palace looked at from their ledges in the evenings, the same Milky Way, the same planets moving along their ancient paths, the same moon tracing its 18-year cycle across the same sky. Nothing essential has changed. The land endures. The sky endures. And somewhere in the traditions of the people who walk their plazas and tend their fields and conduct their ceremonies in the pueblos of New Mexico and Arizona, the memory of this place endures too, encoded in forms that resist forgetting, because they are woven into the practices of daily life so deeply that to lose them would be to lose something of the self. Sleep now, if you are ready. Let the canyon country settle around you in the dark, vast and silent, and full of the presence of lives that were lived here with great care and great skill and great beauty. Let the sound of the wind through the sage and the distant trickle of water somewhere in the canyon be the last things you hear. Let the thought of the cliff dwellers be the last thought you carry with you into sleep. Not as a mystery or a tragedy, but as a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, and that the most extraordinary thing of all is not the buildings or the roads or the pottery or the astronomical alignments, but the simple, persistent fact of human life, continuing, adapting, carrying forward across every obstacle, finding a way, finding always, somehow, a way. There are questions about this civilization that the physical evidence alone cannot answer, questions that require us to sit with uncertainty and resist the temptation to fill the gaps with speculation dressed up as knowledge. One of those questions concerns the interior life of the people, the emotional and psychological texture of existence in the cliff dwellings, the things that mattered to them, that left no trace in the archaeological record precisely because they were lived rather than made. Love, grief, ambition, boredom, the particular quality of satisfaction that comes from doing difficult work well. These are the experiences that make a life recognizable from the inside, and they are exactly the experiences that archaeology is least equipped to recover. But the attempt is still worth making, because if we cannot imagine the people of the cliff dwellings as fully human, we cannot truly understand what was lost and what was carried forward when they made the decision to leave. Consider what it would have meant to grow up in Cliff Palace. Your first memories would have been shaped by stone and shadow and the constant presence of the canyon, its scale so familiar that you would not have registered it as extraordinary. The smells of your childhood would have been the smell of corn grinding and wood smoke, and the mineral tang of the canyon walls after rain, and the sharp sweetness of sage on the mesa top above. Your earliest sounds would have been the grinding of the metates, the voices of the women working together, the sound of the men's society singing in the kiva below, the distant cry of a hawk somewhere in the blue strip of sky above the canyon rim. You would have learned to walk on stone, to navigate the narrow ledges and steep trails without fear, your small feet finding the hand and toe holds in the cliff face as naturally as the children of flat ground find the steps of a staircase. You would have known every person in your community from birth, known their faces and their voices and their habits and their specific skills, known who made the best pots and who was the most patient teacher and who had the temper that flared without warning and who told the best stories in the evenings. In a community of 150 people, there were no strangers. There was no anonymity. Every action you took, every decision you made, reflected not just on you, but on your family and your clan, because everyone knew everyone and remembered everything. This created a kind of social pressure that could be either steadying or suffocating, depending on the moment. A constant awareness of being seen and known and judged that would have been as much a part of the air of Cliff Palace as the smell of corn and wood smoke. The children of the cliff dwellings grew up immersed in the full complexity of adult life, in a way that is difficult to imagine in the context of modern childhood. There was no separate sphere of childhood experience, no segregation of children from the adult world of work and ceremony and grief and celebration. Children were present at births and deaths, at the ceremonies of the kiva, at the grinding and the farming and the hunting and the making of pots and baskets. They learned by watching and then by doing, taking on progressively more demanding tasks as their competence grew, moving from carrying water to grinding corn, to tending the fields, to participating in the less demanding aspects of the ceremonies as they grew older. By the time a young person reached what we would consider adolescence, they were already fully contributing members of the community. Their skills developed to the point where they could take on much of the work that sustained the group. Childhood illness and death were constants that no family escaped. The infant mortality rate in the cliff-dwelling communities was high, and the skeletal remains of children make up a significant portion of the human remains recovered from ancestral Puebloan sites. Respiratory infections, encouraged by the smoke of the indoor fires that heated the rooms and cooked the food and fired the pottery, appear to have been common causes of childhood illness and death. Malnutrition, particularly in years of poor harvest, left its mark on the bones of children in the form of growth disruptions visible as horizontal lines in the dental enamel and the bone cortex. Trauma from falls, an ever-present risk in the cliff dwellings with their narrow ledges and unguarded drops, appears in the skeletal record as healed fractures in the bones of children and adults alike. And yet the people also took care of each other with a tenderness that is visible in the archaeological record in ways that are moving to consider. Skeletal remains from ancestral Puebloan sites show evidence of individuals who survived serious injuries that would have been life-threatening, or at least severely disabling. Injuries that could only have been survived with sustained care from others in the community. An adult with a healed compound fracture of the leg who would have needed weeks of immobilization and feeding, while others brought food and water and managed the risk of infection. An older person whose skeletal evidence of severe arthritis must have made ordinary movement painful, but who continued to live in the community, presumably cared for by younger members of the extended family. The bodies of infants buried beneath room floors or in middens with evident care, sometimes accompanied by small objects: a piece of turquoise, a painted ceramic bowl, a string of shell beads, suggesting that even very young lives were mourned and their passing marked with ceremony. The turquoise that appears in ancestral Puebloan burials and ritual contexts across the entire cultural sequence deserves its own consideration, because the importance of this particular mineral to this particular culture was extraordinary and speaks to something deep about their aesthetic and spiritual values. Turquoise is not a particularly rare mineral in the geological context of the American Southwest, where copper-rich deposits occur in numerous locations across the region. But the specific quality of turquoise, that particular shade of blue-green that shifts in different lights between the color of the sky at the horizon and the color of shallow Caribbean water, struck the ancestral Puebloans as something that connected the earthly and the celestial, that partook of both the sky above and the water that the sky dropped onto the earth, that was, in some essential way, the substance of the cosmic order made visible and holdable. The mines at Cerrillos, south of modern Santa Fe, were worked for turquoise by the ancestral Puebloans for centuries before the Chacoan period, and the scale of the Chacoan turquoise industry suggests an organization of labor and a commitment of resources that bordered on the obsessional. Archaeologists working at Pueblo Bonito have recovered more than 50,000 pieces of turquoise from a single room, clearly a workshop deposit representing a production center of significant scale. The turquoise was shaped into beads, into pendants, into the mosaic inlays that decorated wooden and bone objects of ritual and personal significance, into the large flat plaques that appear in elite burial contexts and that represent perhaps the most labor-intensive form of the craft, each plaque requiring the grinding and shaping of hundreds of individual turquoise tesserae and their careful arrangement into precise geometric patterns. The distribution of turquoise objects in ancestral Puebloan communities was not uniform. The most elaborate turquoise jewelry and the largest accumulations of turquoise appear consistently in contexts associated with high-status individuals and ritual spaces, a pattern that suggests the material was not just aesthetically valued, but socially significant, that its possession and display marked individuals and spaces as connected to the higher orders of reality that the ceremonies were directed toward maintaining. The person buried with 50 turquoise beads around their neck was not just someone who liked jewelry. They were someone whose relationship to the spiritual world was understood by the community to be of a particular quality, someone through whom the connection between the human world and the cosmic order ran with unusual strength or clarity. The shell ornaments that appear alongside turquoise in ancestral Puebloan ritual and burial contexts came from even greater distances, from the Pacific coast and from the Gulf of California, carried into the desert interior through trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles across some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. The particular shells most valued by the ancestral Puebloans, the large Glycymeris clam, whose circular shell made an ideal bracelet when worked into a ring, the spondylus spiny oyster, whose vivid orange-red color made it one of the most visually striking trade goods in the entire pre-Columbian world, had to be transported from coastal environments completely alien to the canyon country, across deserts and mountains and rivers, before they arrived in the hands of the artisans who worked them into the objects that the archaeological record preserves. This long-distance trade was itself a form of connection to the wider world, a reminder that the canyon country was not isolated, but embedded in a network of relationships that extended across the continent and eventually into Mesoamerica. The people of the cliff dwellings were not provincial. They were participants in one of the most extensive economic and cultural exchange networks in the pre-Columbian world, their pottery styles and ceremonial traditions influencing and being influenced by communities hundreds of miles away, their knowledge of the sky and the land and the behavior of plants and animals, connecting them to traditions that stretched back to the beginning of human life in the Americas. The pottery, beyond its functional and aesthetic dimensions, was one of the primary vehicles of cultural communication within this network. The designs painted on vessels traveled with the vessels along trade routes, entering new communities and being absorbed into local visual traditions, modified and reinterpreted by local potters who understood the conventions of the system but applied them with their own creative sensibility. Researchers, tracking the spread of specific design elements across the ancestral Puebloan world, have been able to reconstruct the flow of ideas and influences through the trade network with a precision that sometimes rivals what the written historical record allows for better documented civilizations. The rock art that covers the canyon walls throughout the ancestral Puebloan world is another form of communication that has been less fully deciphered, but that clearly represents a sophisticated system of visual meaning. The petroglyphs and pictographs that appear on canyon walls and boulder faces throughout the Four Corners region range from simple geometric marks to elaborate figurative compositions depicting human beings, animals, supernatural beings, and ceremonial scenes, executed in styles that changed dramatically across the millennia of their production. The oldest images, dating to the Archaic period, thousands of years before the cliff-dwelling era, have an entirely different visual character from the images produced by the ancestral Puebloans of the Pueblo period, suggesting not a single continuous tradition, but multiple overlapping traditions that used the same walls as their canvas. What did the ancestral Puebloan rock art mean? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans, the Hopi and Zuni and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, have traditions of interpretation for some categories of rock art imagery, understanding certain symbols as clan markings or travel markers or records of specific historical events or locations of ceremonially significant features of the landscape. But much of the meaning that was obvious to the people who made these images has been lost along with the oral traditions that would have explained it, and archaeologists and rock art researchers are left to work with what the images themselves reveal, which is often suggestive, but rarely definitive. What is clear from even a superficial study of ancestral Puebloan rock art is that it was not casual or random. The selection of specific locations for the placement of images, often on prominent faces of rock that are highly visible from certain approaches, or that receive light in particular ways at particular times of year, suggests that the makers understood the relationship between image and location as significant. The clustering of images at certain sites, where dozens or hundreds of individual images accumulate over generations to create complex palimpsests of overlapping marks from different periods, suggests that certain locations carried a special status as places where the conversation between the human and the spiritual world was particularly clear. The water management systems that the Ancestral Puebloans developed across the Colorado Plateau represent another dimension of their relationship with the land that deserves more attention than it usually receives in popular accounts of this civilization. Water is the fundamental limiting resource in the desert Southwest, the factor that determines where agriculture is possible, how large the population can grow, how resistant a community is to the inevitable years of drought. The people who developed successful long-term strategies for managing water in this landscape were essentially managing the future, building infrastructure whose benefits would extend across generations, in the same way that the great houses of Chaco Canyon were investments in a social and spiritual order intended to persist indefinitely. The check dams built across the small drainages of the mesa tops at Mesa Verde are perhaps the most numerous and widespread evidence of this water management tradition. These structures, built from locally available sandstone blocks and positioned at intervals down the drainage channels, were designed to slow the rapid runoff from summer thunderstorms and spread it more gently across a broader area of the agricultural fields, both reducing erosion and increasing the moisture available to the crops. They had to be rebuilt and repaired after every major flood, and the investment of labor required to maintain them across entire agricultural landscapes was substantial. But the agricultural security they provided was worth the investment, extending the zone of productive farming into areas that would have been too dry or too erosion-prone to cultivate without them. The more elaborate water management systems found at some ancestral Puebloan sites approach the sophistication of small-scale irrigation systems. At Chaco Canyon in Bandelier National Monument, an area where many of the migrants from the northern San Juan region eventually settled in the early 14th century, archaeologists have identified a complex network of ditches and canals that directed water from the main stream channel onto agricultural terraces constructed on the canyon slopes. This system, maintained and elaborated over several generations, transformed canyon terrain that would naturally support only limited agriculture into productive fields capable of yielding substantial harvests. The engineering knowledge required to design and build such a system, understanding the hydraulics of channel flow and the relationship between water application and soil moisture at a level sufficient to make accurate predictions about where to build the ditches and how to grade them for optimal effect, was sophisticated by any standard. The pine forests that covered the higher elevations of the Colorado Plateau were another critical resource for the Ancestral Puebloans, and the management of those forests was as carefully attended to as the management of water. The great houses of Chaco Canyon required hundreds of thousands of trees for their construction, and the forests of the Chusca Mountains and Mount Taylor were the primary sources of that timber, their logs transported to the canyon by human muscle power across distances of 60 to 100 kilometers. The intensive logging of these forests during the Chacoan period left a mark in the tree ring record and in the archaeological evidence of soil erosion on deforested hillsides that is clearly visible to researchers today. Whether the Chacoans fully recognized the extent to which they were depleting the resource base that their construction program depended on is an interesting and unanswerable question, but the evidence suggests that the consequences of the deforestation contributed to the difficulties of the post-Chacoan period, when the combination of reduced timber availability and a changing climate made the ambitious building programs of the Great Houses period increasingly difficult to sustain. At Mesa Verde and other sites in the northern San Juan region, the forests of pinyon, pine, and juniper that covered the mesa tops were managed more carefully than the ponderosa forests of the Chacoan timber supply zone, probably because the scale of the construction programs at these sites was smaller and the relationship between the residents and the surrounding landscape was more immediate. The people of Mesa Verde burned the mesa top forests periodically, not to destroy them but to manage them, clearing the undergrowth that competed with the trees and the agricultural fields, while allowing the mature trees to survive and continue producing the piñon nuts that were an important supplementary food source. This practice of deliberate landscape burning, maintaining the open woodland character of the mesa tops that maximized both timber production and agricultural potential, is a form of land management sophisticated enough that it has only recently come to be fully appreciated by modern ecologists studying the historical ecology of the Colorado Plateau. The animals of the canyon country were managed as carefully as the plants and the water. The turkey herds maintained in pens adjacent to the cliff dwellings were not just sources of meat and feathers. They were part of a broader system of animal husbandry, whose details are becoming clearer as researchers apply new analytical techniques to the archaeological record. Isotope analysis of turkey bones from ancestral Puebloan sites has shown that the turkeys were being fed on agricultural products, primarily corn, rather than foraging for their own food, which implies a system of deliberate feeding that went significantly beyond simple confinement. The scale of turkey keeping at some sites, with dozens or even hundreds of birds being maintained in adjacent pens, suggests that the turkeys were being raised specifically for production, rather than just being kept as a general resource to be drawn on as needed. The management of deer populations was more diffuse but no less deliberate. The seasonal hunting patterns that are visible in the faunal remains from ancestral Puebloan sites suggest a system of harvest management in which the timing and location of hunting was calibrated to the reproductive cycle of the deer population, taking males preferentially during the breeding season, when they were most active and most vulnerable, while avoiding the females during the months when they were pregnant or nursing young. Whether this management was the result of explicit cultural rules about hunting practice or simply the accumulated wisdom of generations of hunters who had observed the relationship between hunting pressure and deer population dynamics, it represents a form of wildlife management whose sophistication is only now beginning to be appreciated by researchers working in the field of historical ecology. The question of what the ancestral Puebloans knew about their environment and how they knew it is one of the most interesting questions that the study of this civilization raises. The knowledge encoded in their agricultural systems, their water management techniques, their forest management practices, their astronomical observations, their ceramic technologies, their architectural achievements, represents an accumulation of empirical understanding about the world that was acquired through generations of careful observation and preserved through the transmission of practical knowledge from elders to younger community members. This was science in the most fundamental sense of the word, the systematic observation of the natural world and the application of those observations to practical problems, conducted without instruments more sophisticated than the human senses and the ceramic and stone and wood technologies of a pre-metal society. The modern tendency to regard the pre-Columbian peoples of North America as primitive or unsophisticated reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what sophistication means in different contexts. The ancestral Puebloans did not have writing, they did not have metal tools, they did not have the wheel. But in the specific context of the environment they inhabited and the challenges they faced, they developed responses of extraordinary sophistication that allowed them to maintain a complex civilization in conditions that would defeat most modern societies. Stripped of their technological infrastructure, the knowledge of when to plant, where to plant, how to manage water, how to build for the thermal characteristics of the desert climate, how to maintain social cohesion across generations of stress and change. These are not primitive understandings. They are the products of a research program extending across millennia. The trauma of the late 13th century, the drought and the violence and the spiritual crisis and the final abandonment cannot be separated from the deeper history of resilience and adaptation that preceded it. The people who walked out of the canyon country in the 1280s and 1290s were not defeated. They were the inheritors of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom about how to survive in a difficult world. And they carried that wisdom with them into the new landscapes they were walking toward. The new communities they built in the Rio Grande Valley and on the Hopi Mesas were not fresh starts. They were continuations, built on the same foundations of knowledge and practice that had sustained their ancestors through every previous crisis, adapted to new conditions with the flexibility that was perhaps the most essential characteristic of the ancestral Puebloan cultural tradition. The Spanish who arrived in the 16th century found not a primitive or static culture, but a sophisticated and deeply rooted one that had been continuously developing and adapting for millennia. The pueblos they encountered were the product of this long evolution, large aggregated communities whose social organization, agricultural systems, ceremonial traditions, and artistic achievements reflected a maturity that 2.5 centuries of post-Mesa Verde development had produced from the already sophisticated foundations of the cliff-dwelling period. The conquistadors saw the pueblos through the lens of their own cultural assumptions about what civilization looked like, assumptions shaped by the cities and monuments of Europe and Mesoamerica, and what they saw did not match those expectations closely enough for them to recognize the depth of what they were encountering. This failure of recognition had catastrophic consequences for the Pueblo peoples, who were subjected to a colonial regime that understood their culture primarily as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a tradition to be engaged. But the culture proved more resilient than the colonizers expected. The same adaptive capacity that had allowed the ancestral Puebloans to survive the droughts and the violence and the Great Migration of the 13th century allowed their descendants to survive the epidemics and the forced labor and the forced religious suppression of the colonial period. The traditions were maintained, sometimes openly and sometimes secretly, but always persistently, across the 4 centuries of the Spanish and later American colonial periods, until the 20th century, when the formal protections of indigenous rights that the United States government eventually adopted allowed the Pueblo peoples to practice their traditions more openly and to reclaim some of the cultural and intellectual sovereignty that had been under sustained assault for centuries. Today, the Pueblos of New Mexico and the Hopi villages of Arizona are living communities that maintain active ceremonial traditions, practice traditional agricultural techniques alongside modern ones, produce pottery and weaving and jewelry in the traditions established by their ancestral Puebloan predecessors, and carry within their oral traditions the memories of a past that extends back further than any written record in the Western Hemisphere. The Hopi people, in particular, maintained ceremonial traditions whose continuity with the practices of the cliff-dwelling period is directly traceable in the archaeological record. Their Kachina ceremonies, incorporating specific iconographic elements that appear in the wall paintings of 14th century sites with unmistakable clarity. The archaeologists and anthropologists who study the ancestral Puebloans and their descendants have, over the past several decades, developed a much more collaborative relationship with the descendant communities than was characteristic of the earlier history of southwestern archaeology. When the excavation of ancestral sites and the removal of human remains and sacred objects to distant museums was conducted without the knowledge or consent of the people whose heritage was being studied, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 was a significant legislative acknowledgement of the rights of descendant communities to participate in decisions about how the remains of their ancestors are treated, and it has led to the repatriation of human remains and sacred objects from museums across the country to the communities from which they came. This repatriation process has had unexpected benefits for the scientific study of the ancestral Puebloans as well. The collaborative relationships developed between researchers and descendant communities in the context of repatriation discussions have opened channels of communication about the oral traditions and cultural knowledge that the descendant communities possess, knowledge that significantly enriches the archaeological interpretation of the physical record. The Hopi, for example, have clan histories that identify specific sites in the landscape of the Colorado Plateau as stopping places of specific clans during the migrations of the 13th and 14th centuries, and these identifications have been confirmed in many cases by the archaeological evidence found at those sites. This alignment between oral tradition and archaeological record is powerful evidence for the remarkable accuracy with which these traditions have been maintained across 7 centuries of transmission, and it suggests that the oral traditions of the descendant communities are a valuable and largely underutilized source of information about the prehistoric past. The physical landscape of the canyon country has itself been a significant factor in the preservation of both the archaeological remains and the cultural memories of the ancestral Puebloans. The dry climate of the Colorado Plateau, which creates conditions so challenging for human agriculture, is extraordinarily effective at preserving organic materials that would decay within years or decades in moister environments. The wooden ceiling beams of the cliff dwellings, the fiber sandals and baskets and cordage left behind when the communities departed, the remnants of food stored in sealed granaries, all have survived in conditions that allow them to be studied today, with a completeness that archaeologists working in more humid environments can only dream of. The tree ring records that provide the most precise climate data available for the ancestral Puebloan period are recoverable precisely because the dry climate of the southwest has preserved wooden beams from centuries old, structures in sufficient numbers to allow the statistical analysis of ring width variations that dendroclimatologists use to reconstruct past climate conditions. The national parks and monuments that protect the major ancestral Puebloan sites in the Four Corners region, Mesa Verde National Park, Chaco National Historical Park, Bandelier National Monument, Canyon de Chelly National Monument, Hovenweep National Monument, among others, have played a crucial role in the preservation of these sites against the looting and vandalism that devastated many ancestral Puebloan sites before federal protection was established. The history of that protection is itself a complicated story, involving the competing interests of tourists, archaeologists, developers, and the descendant communities whose heritage is at stake. But the net result has been the preservation of a body of archaeological evidence that continues to yield new insights into the nature and history of this remarkable civilization. New technologies are transforming the study of the ancestral Puebloans in ways that would have been unimaginable to the early archaeologists who first excavated the great houses and cliff dwellings. Remote sensing techniques, including LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to detect subtle topographic features through vegetation cover, have revealed previously unknown road segments and agricultural features that ground-based survey had missed. DNA analysis of human remains from ancestral Puebloan sites is providing new information about the genetic relationships between different communities and between the prehistoric populations and their modern descendants, confirming in many cases the connections that oral tradition had always maintained. Isotope analysis of food remains and human bone is revealing details of diet and movement that allow researchers to track the migrations of individuals as well as populations, identifying people who were born in one region and moved to another in ways that illuminate the social dynamics of the migration period. The picture of the ancestral Puebloans that emerges from all this evidence, old and new, is richer and more complex than it appeared even a generation ago. The simple narrative of a civilization that rose, declined, and disappeared in the face of drought and violence has given way to a more nuanced understanding of a culture characterized by extraordinary resilience and adaptability, by aesthetic achievement of the highest order, by social and spiritual sophistication that allowed it to maintain its essential character across millennia of change, and by a relationship with the land that, while not without its destructive dimensions, was founded on a depth of knowledge and a quality of attention that the people who inherited this landscape have never fully replicated. The ancestral Puebloans did not disappear, they transformed. And the transformation that began in the late 13th century, when the people walked out of the canyon country and carried their traditions south and east into new landscapes, is not yet complete. It is still happening. In the ceremonies of the Rio Grande Pueblos and the Hopi villages, in the pottery being made today, in the same traditions that the cliff-dwelling potters established, in the corn being planted in the same varieties, and with many of the same techniques that sustained the people of Mesa Verde 7 centuries ago, in the stories being told and the songs being sung and the prayers being offered to the same sky above the same desert that watched over the entire 10,000-year story of human life on the Colorado Plateau. The canyon country is quiet now, in the hours before dawn. The stars are still sharp and clear above the canyon walls. Somewhere in the darkness of the alcoves, the walls of the cliff dwellings hold the coolness of the night against the coming heat of the day, just as they were designed to do, their thick sandstone masonry still performing the thermal function. It was built to perform 700 years after the builders walked away. The sipapu holes in the kiva floors are still open to whatever lies beneath them. The grinding stones are still smooth where the generations of hands wore them. The hand and toe hold trails are still cut into the cliff face, still functional, still usable by anyone willing to trust their weight to the same notches that the children of Cliff Palace used to run up and down without a second thought. The people are gone from these spaces, but the spaces are not empty. They are full of time, of accumulated presence, of the residue of lives that were lived here with complete commitment to the project of human existence in one of the most demanding and beautiful places on earth. If you are very still and very quiet and very willing to listen, you can feel that presence, not as a ghost story, not as anything supernatural, but simply as the weight of human time accumulated in a particular place. The way that weight accumulates in any space where people have lived and worked and loved and died across many generations. That weight is the most valuable thing the canyon country holds. More valuable than the turquoise, more valuable than the great houses, more valuable than the pottery, or the road network, or the astronomical alignments. It is the record of people who were fully here, who gave everything they had to the project of living in this place and building something worthy of it, who carried their traditions forward across every obstacle and every crisis, and who, in the end, proved themselves equal to whatever the world required of them. Rest now. The canyon holds you. The stars are patient above the canyon walls, and somewhere, in a pueblo in New Mexico or on a mesa in Arizona, the descendants of the cliff dwellers are sleeping under the same sky, carrying in their dreams the memories of a journey that began 10,000 years ago and has not yet ended. It has not yet ended. And that is the most important thing about this story. Not that the cliff dwellings are empty, not that the civilization that built them faced a crisis it could not overcome in its original form, but that the people survived, that the knowledge survived, that the traditions survived, that the relationship between human beings and this particular landscape, forged across 10 millennia of intimate occupation, survived in the people who carried it forward into new landscapes and new circumstances, and who maintain it still, in the ceremonies and the pottery and the farming and the stories and the prayers that connect the living to the dead and the present to the past, across a continuity of human experience that nothing in the last 7 centuries has been able to break. The Anasazi did not disappear. They are still here. They have always been here. They will be here long after the rest of us have become as forgotten as we fear they were, because they understood something that most civilizations learn too late, if they learn it at all, that the land is not a resource to be exploited, but a home to be tended, that the sky is not a backdrop to human drama, but a partner in it, that the stories of the people who came before are not burdens but gifts, carrying within them the knowledge of how to survive and how to live with beauty, even in the most difficult circumstances. That is what the cliff dwellings are trying to tell us, standing in their alcoves with their walls still upright after 7 centuries of abandonment, their windows still framing the same views of canyon and sky that the people who built them looked out at every morning of their lives. They are not monuments to a lost civilization. They are evidence of a living one, evidence that people were here, fully here, and that being here mattered enough to build something worthy of it, something that would outlast the builders and carry their presence forward into a future they could not see but trusted would come. We are that future. We are looking at what they built and feeling the weight of what it means. And if we are paying attention, we understand that the story they began is still ours to continue, in whatever way we are capable of, with whatever wisdom we can muster, in whatever landscape we have inherited and are in the process of making our own. The canyon is quiet. The stars are moving slowly in their ancient courses above the canyon walls. The buildings are still standing. Sleep now. There is a particular quality to the silence at Chaco Canyon in the hours before sunrise. The darkness in the canyon itself is almost absolute. The stars overhead brilliant and close in the way that desert skies can be when the air is clear and dry and there is no artificial light for 50 miles in any direction. The great hulk of Pueblo Bonito is visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the canyon wall it rests against. Its silhouette familiar and strange at the same time. The geometry of its walls and towers, more architectural than natural, but rendered ambiguous by the darkness, into something that might almost be a geological formation, might almost be something that grew here rather than something that was built. In the hour before dawn, the canyon begins to fill with the particular sounds of high desert morning. The wind, that never entirely stops, picks up slightly, carrying with it the smell of the sage that covers the canyon floor and the dusty mineral scent of the sandstone walls. A raven calls somewhere in the darkness, its voice echoing off the canyon walls in a way that makes it impossible to locate precisely. The temperature, which will climb dramatically once the sun appears above the canyon rim, is hovering near freezing, the cold of the desert night reluctant to yield to the warmth that is coming. And then, as the eastern horizon begins to lighten, almost imperceptibly, something extraordinary happens. At the winter solstice, if you are standing in exactly the right place in the canyon, the first light of the rising sun enters the canyon through a gap in the canyon wall to the east and falls in a long, brilliant shaft on the south-facing wall of Pueblo Alto, illuminating a pair of spiral petroglyphs there with a precision that could not be accidental. At the summer solstice, the light enters the Casa Rinconada, Great Kiva, through a series of wall niches aligned with the rising sun and creates a shadow pattern on the interior floor that marks the precise moment of solstice with mathematical accuracy. At the equinoxes, specific doorways and windows in the great houses are illuminated by the rising sun in ways that align with the architectural geometry in patterns too regular to be coincidental. The Ancestral Puebloans were not the only ancient people to build astronomical alignments into their architecture. The tradition of solar and lunar alignment in monumental architecture extends from Stonehenge in Britain to the great temples of Egypt, to the pyramid complexes of Mesoamerica, and the precise mechanisms by which pre-literate peoples achieved these alignments without modern instruments or mathematical tools are only beginning to be understood. What was possible with sustained and careful observation across multiple generations, with the transmission of observational knowledge through a carefully maintained oral tradition, with a social commitment to the accuracy of astronomical observations that was reinforced by the practical necessity of having a reliable agricultural calendar, turns out to be very considerable indeed. The alignments at Chaco Canyon are not more impressive than those at Stonehenge, but they are not less impressive either, and they were achieved by a culture that is too often underestimated, precisely because it did not leave behind the written records that allow us to document the sophistication of other ancient astronomical traditions. The roads of the Chacoan system present a different kind of mystery. We can see them clearly from the air and from satellite imagery. We can measure their dimensions with precision. We can trace their routes across the landscape for miles, confirming their engineered quality in the labor that went into their construction. What we cannot yet fully explain is why they were built the way they were, and this uncertainty about purpose makes them one of the most intellectually challenging aspects of the entire ancestral Puebloan phenomenon. The argument that the roads were primarily functional, facilitating the movement of people and goods across the landscape of the Chacoan system, runs into the problem of the road's dimensions. 8 to 10 meters wide is far more than would be necessary for foot traffic, which was the only form of locomotion available. The roads could have been narrower and still served their function perfectly well. Something about the width mattered, and that something was almost certainly not practical but symbolic, a statement encoded in the dimensions of the road itself about the power and reach of the system it served. Some researchers have proposed that the roads were designed specifically to accommodate large numbers of people walking abreast during the periodic pilgrimage gatherings that appear to have been one of the central functions of the Chacoan system. On this view, the roads were not intended for everyday travel, but for the ceremonial processions that marked the major ritual events of the Chacoan calendar, events at which hundreds or possibly thousands of people from outlier communities across the region converged on Chaco Canyon simultaneously. The wide roads would have allowed these large groups to travel in formation, maintaining the ceremonial character of the procession rather than stretching into a long, straggling line. The straightness of the roads, maintained even where deviating slightly, would have made the journey significantly easier, would then be understood as a formal quality, a statement that the road itself was not merely a path, but a ritual object, a line of intention cut across the landscape to connect two points that had a relationship, not just geographic, but spiritual. This interpretation is consistent with the evidence from the road network as a whole, which shows multiple roads converging on Chaco Canyon from different directions and from different distances, all aimed at a common center, with a directional precision that suggests their purpose was to articulate a spatial relationship between the outliers and the hub, to make visible in the landscape the connections that existed in the social and spiritual world. The roads made the Chacoan system legible, inscribed its structure onto the desert surface in a form that could be read by anyone traveling through the landscape, a statement in engineering about who was connected to whom and how. The stairways cut into the cliff faces that the roads encountered rather than avoided are some of the most physically impressive features of the Chacoan road system. At several locations across the plateau, the roads descend precipitous cliff faces by means of broad stairways cut into the sandstone bedrock with the same stone tools that were used to build the great houses. Each step shaped with care to provide a reliable foothold on a surface that the desert climate keeps perpetually dry and dusty. The labor required to cut these stairways from solid rock was substantial, and their creation was clearly deliberate and planned rather than improvised in response to an obstacle encountered in the course of laying out the road. The road builders knew the terrain. They chose to go straight rather than around, and they invested the labor necessary to make the straight route passable. The outlier great houses that the roads connected to Chaco Canyon are scattered across a vast region of the Colorado Plateau, some of them hundreds of kilometers from the canyon itself. Sites like Salmon Ruins on the San Juan River in northern New Mexico, Chimney Rock in Colorado, the Aztec Ruins on the Animas River, and dozens of smaller, outlier communities each contain one or more structures built in the distinctive Chacoan style, with the core and veneer masonry, the T-shaped doorways, and the great kiva forms that identify them as part of the Chacoan cultural sphere. In some cases, the outlier great houses appear to have been built by people from Chaco itself, perhaps communities of Chacoan craftspeople who were established at strategic locations in the network. In other cases, they appear to represent local communities that adopted Chacoan architectural forms and material culture, aligning themselves with the dominant regional tradition for reasons that may have combined practical economic advantages with genuine cultural affiliation. The Chimney Rock site in southwestern Colorado occupies a particularly dramatic position. Its great kiva and associated structures, built on a narrow mesa between two natural rock pillars that rise above the surrounding landscape like the posts of a gateway. Twice every 18-year lunar standstill cycle, the full moon rises directly between the two pillars when viewed from the Great Kiva, an astronomical event of such visual drama that it is difficult to imagine it was not a significant factor in the choice of this particular location for a Chacoan outlier community. The site's position at the northern edge of the Chacoan interaction sphere, in a landscape that receives sufficient rainfall to support agriculture, without the elaborate water management techniques required in the drier regions to the south and west, suggests that it served as both an agricultural resource area and an astronomical observatory for the Chacoan system. The people who traveled the Chacoan roads, whatever their specific purpose, were moving through a landscape that they understood with the intimacy of people whose entire lives were embedded in it. The desert southwest may look empty and forbidding to modern observers, passing through it quickly by car or plane, but to people who traveled it on foot and had learned its character through generations of intimate occupation, it was full of meaning and resource and beauty. Every canyon, every spring, every distinctive rock formation, every variety of plant and animal had a name and a story and a place in the web of knowledge that constituted the community's understanding of its world. The roads of the Chacoan system traveled through a landscape that was not wilderness in the modern sense of a place untouched by human presence, but a deeply humanized place, shaped by the attention and labor and spiritual investment of generations of people who understood it as their home. The violence of the late pre-contact period, particularly concentrated in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, is one of the most difficult aspects of the ancestral Puebloan story to integrate into the broader narrative of cultural achievement and resilience. It would be convenient if the evidence for violence could be dismissed or explained away, and there was a period in southwestern archaeology when the tendency was to minimize or discount evidence for conflict among the ancestral Puebloans in favor of a more harmonious image of a peaceful agricultural society living in balance with its environment. That period is over. The evidence is too extensive and too clear to ignore, and the intellectual honesty that is the foundation of good archaeology requires acknowledging it, even when it complicates the picture. The violence was real. It was widespread. It took forms that are disturbing by any standard, including forms that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of ritual cannibalism at certain sites. Though this interpretation remains controversial, and the evidence for it is not universally accepted, what is not controversial is that people were killed in large numbers at multiple sites across the Colorado Plateau in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, that communities were burned and their populations massacred, and that this violence was a significant factor in the demographic and social disruption of the period. What remains uncertain is the precise nature and causes of the violence. Was it endemic warfare between neighboring communities, competing for scarce resources? Was it the systematic violence of a social hierarchy, attempting to maintain its position against the resistance of increasingly desperate subordinate groups? Was it the violence of external raiders, perhaps including the ancestors of the Navajo and Apache peoples who were moving into the southwest from the north in this period, though the timing of their arrival is itself debated? The most likely answer is that the violence of the late 13th century had multiple causes that reinforced each other in a self-amplifying cycle of insecurity and aggression, in which the breakdown of the social systems that had previously maintained order left communities vulnerable to predation from both outside and inside, and the experience of violence in turn further disrupted the social systems that might have contained it. The architectural evidence of the cliff dwellings as defensive structures is consistent with this picture of endemic insecurity. The specific design choices that make the cliff dwellings hard to attack and easy to defend were not made casually or in response to a single specific threat. They were the result of extended experience of vulnerability and the considered response of people who had thought carefully about how to protect their communities against the kinds of threats they were actually facing. The cliff dwellings were not built as a permanent architectural solution to the problem of defense. They were built as a temporary fortress for a community that hoped, perhaps, that the crisis would eventually pass, and that they would be able to return to the more open, more expansive way of life that the Mesa top communities had represented. The fact that the crisis did not pass, that the combination of drought and violence and spiritual disruption proved too severe to sustain the community in the canyon country, does not diminish the achievement of the cliff dwellings. It adds to their poignancy, the extraordinary effort that went into buildings that were in the end temporary homes for a people in transition. The specific patterns of departure from the northern San Juan region suggest that the abandonment was managed rather than panicked, that the community leaders, whoever they were, maintained enough social authority to organize the departure in a way that maximized the community's chances of successful integration into the communities they were moving toward. The careful sealing of food stores, the closing ceremonies in the kivas, the transport of valued objects and materials, all of these suggest a level of social organization and planning that is inconsistent with the image of a community fleeing in terror. The people who left Mesa Verde in the 1280s were making a difficult decision under difficult circumstances, but they were making it with the full exercise of the cultural resources they had developed over 1,000 years of civilization. The knowledge of where to go, the relationships that existed between the northern San Juan communities and the communities of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi mesas that would receive the migrants, was itself a product of the long-distance trade networks and the ceremonial connections that had been maintained across the ancestral Puebloan world for centuries. The migrants were not moving into unknown territory. They were moving toward places they knew about, communities with which they had cultural and probably kinship connections, places that had been identified through the network of relationships that the Chacoan system had helped to create and maintain across the entire Southwest. The roads that had carried pilgrims to Chaco Canyon in the 11th and 12th centuries were the same roads, or their descendants, that carried migrants away from the northern San Juan region in the 13th century. The network that had been built to connect communities in times of abundance was the network that provided the pathways for migration in times of crisis. This is the deeper meaning of the Chacoan road system, understood not as an isolated phenomenon of the 11th and 12th centuries, but as part of the larger story of the ancestral Puebloan civilization. The roads were not just a statement of Chacoan power. They were infrastructure for the management of uncertainty, a network of connections that could serve multiple purposes across changing circumstances, that could carry ceremonial pilgrims in one era and climate refugees in another, that could sustain a regional economic system in times of surplus and provide pathways for redistribution in times of scarcity. The people who built the roads were not just building a road network, they were building resilience into the landscape itself, creating a set of relationships and pathways that would outlast the specific social system that had motivated their construction and continue to serve the needs of the people long after the great houses of Chaco Canyon had fallen. Silent, the descendants of the ancestral Puebloans understand this continuity in ways that outsiders often miss. When Hopi elders speak of the migrations that their ancestors undertook, they are not describing a catastrophe, they are describing a fulfillment, a completion of the pattern that the holy people prescribed at the beginning of time, the great spiral of movement that the people were meant to trace across the landscape before finding the center place where they were meant to settle. The stopping places of the migration, the great houses and cliff dwellings and canyon communities, were not failures. They were chapters in a story that was unfolding according to a larger design, each chapter teaching the people something they needed to know, each landscape building their understanding of the world in ways that would prepare them for what was to come. This perspective does not require us to believe that the droughts and the violence and the suffering of the late 13th century were somehow benevolent or intended. It requires only that we understand them as the ancestral Puebloans themselves apparently understood them, as conditions that had to be responded to, not with despair, but with the full exercise of the cultural and practical resources the people possessed, and that the response to those conditions could produce, even out of crisis, something new and vital and worthy of the tradition from which it emerged. The pottery being made today in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona is not a pale echo of the pottery made at Mesa Verde 700 years ago. It is a living tradition that has continued to develop and elaborate itself across the centuries, producing in each generation artists whose work is both continuous with the past and entirely of the present. The Pueblo potters working today, names like Maria Martinez and Lucy Lewis and Helen Singina, women who brought their ancestral traditions to the attention of the world in the 20th century, and whose work now hangs in major museums and sells for prices that reflect its genuine artistic quality, are not museum pieces. They are artists working in a living tradition that connects them directly to the women who ground corn at the grinding stones of Cliff Palace and fired their pots in the open air of the canyon country 7 centuries ago. This living continuity is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the story of the ancestral Puebloans. In a world where civilizations rise and fall and disappear, where the connection between ancient cultures and the people alive today is often attenuated to the point of irrelevance, the descendants of the cliff dwellers maintain a relationship to their past that is not merely historical, but active and practical and deeply felt. The ceremonies they conduct, the crops they plant, the pottery they make, the stories they tell, all of these are both expressions of who they are today and connections to who their ancestors were 1,000 years ago. The thread has never broken. It has been stretched and threatened and pulled in difficult directions, but it has never broken. That thread is the most important thing this story has to offer. Not the drama of the cliff dwellings, or the mystery of the Chacoan roads, or the tragedy of the Great Drought, or the violence of the 13th century, though all of these are part of the story. The most important thing is the thread, the continuity of human culture across time, the demonstration that it is possible to maintain the essential character of a civilization through centuries of change and disruption and catastrophe. If the commitment to that character is deep enough, and the practices that embody it are maintained with sufficient care, that demonstration matters in our own time, when civilizations are changing with a speed and a thoroughness that has few precedents in human history, and when the question of what is worth maintaining, what is essential and what is contingent, has a practical urgency that the academic study of ancient cultures rarely conveys. The Ancestral Puebloans faced that question in its most acute form when the conditions that had sustained their civilization for centuries collapsed within a generation. Their answer, implicit in the decisions they made and the actions they took, was that the knowledge and the ceremonies and the relationships and the stories were worth maintaining, even at the cost of the buildings and the roads and the elaborate social system that had produced them. The people were more important than the institutions. The living tradition was more important than the physical monuments. They were right. The monuments are still standing, mute and magnificent, and increasingly well protected by the National Park Service and the descendant communities whose ancestors built them. But the living tradition that their builders carried south and east is still alive too, still growing, still producing new generations of people who understand themselves as the inheritors of a history that stretches back 10,000 years to the first human footsteps on the Colorado Plateau. That is the real answer to the question the title of this story poses. What really happened to the cliff dwellers? This is what happened. They carried their civilization forward. They transformed it, adapted it, rebuilt it in new landscapes under new conditions. They survived everything that was thrown at them, and they are still here, still farming, still singing, still making pottery, still conducting the ceremonies that maintain their relationship with the land and the sky and the spiritual forces that the Ancestral Puebloans spent 1,000 years learning to understand. The cliff dwellings are empty, the people are not. They have never been gone. And on nights like this one, when the desert sky is full of stars and the canyon walls are dark against the lighter dark of the sky above them, and the silence is as deep and complete as silence ever gets in the human world, you can feel the presence of all those lives, all that accumulated time, all that knowledge and beauty and grief and joy and ordinary daily existence that these stones have held and still hold in the way that stone holds everything, which is to say, perfectly and completely and without end. The buildings stand, the thread holds, the story continues. Rest now. You are held in something very old and very patient and very sure of itself. The kind of thing that outlasts individual human lives and individual human civilizations and even individual human questions about where everyone went and why. The kind of thing that will still be here, still telling its story to whatever beings are capable of listening, long after the questions themselves have been forgotten and replaced by new ones. Sleep well. The canyon holds the night around you. The stars continue their ancient business above the canyon walls. And somewhere in the desert southwest of this very moment, the descendants of the people who built Cliff Palace and Pueblo Bonito and the great kivas of the Chacoan world are sleeping under the same sky, carrying in their dreams the memory of a journey that has not yet reached its end. It has not yet reached its end. Good night.